Late at night in the fall of 1990, a woman stopped her car in front of her mailbox to check her mail. After grabbing the stack of letters, immediately she noticed one envelope in particular looked odd. Unlike the other letters in her hand, this one had no postage, no writing on it, and it was unsealed. Curious, she opened it up, and within seconds, this woman would be literally screaming at the top of her lungs and driving full speed down the road away from her house as fast as she possibly could. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the Amazon Music follow button cleans their house, be sure to sneak in afterwards and untuck all of their bed sheets. Okay, let's get into today's story. "34-year-old Diane Newton King woke up before sunrise. She showered, she curled her bangs, she did her makeup, and then she dressed for work in the most professional women's fashion of the day. She put on pantyhose, a pencil skirt, and a blazer with the absolutely massive shoulder pads. It was the spring of 1990, and in Battle Creek, Michigan, Diane was one of the biggest names in town. Diane anchored the morning news show for Battle Creek's local TV station, WUHQ, which meant most days of the week, Diane had to leave her house by no later than 4:30 a.m. As she shuffled around her two-story farmhouse in her pantyhose, trying to figure out where her briefcase was, Diane's husband, Brad, hollered up at her from the kitchen to tell her that breakfast would be ready in 5 minutes. Diane was thrilled. She had recently discovered that she was pregnant with their second child, and so she was constantly feeling hungry. Diane finally found her briefcase, then she slipped on her shoes and made her way downstairs into the kitchen. Her firstborn child, 2-year-old Marler, was sitting in his high chair chomping away on some apple slices. Diane kissed him on the forehead before sliding into her own seat at the kitchen table. 43-year-old Brad brought Diane a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. It was her favorite, and he made it for her every morning. Brad worked part-time as a criminal justice professor at the University of Western Michigan, but he liked to tell people that his real job was taking care of Diane and Marler. And for the most part, that was actually pretty true. Most days, while Diane was at work, Brad managed things on the home front. It was an untraditional dynamic for the time, and some of their friends jokingly called him Mr. Diane King, but Brad didn't mind. He was proud of Diane, and he was happy to support her this way. Diane scarfed down her breakfast, gave Brad and Marler a kiss goodbye, and then she grabbed her coat and raced out the door just as the clock hit 4:30 a.m. Outside the farmhouse, Diane paused for just a moment. She'd always wanted to live on a farm, and when she looked out across their property, with the cement silo on the left and the old red and white Victorian barn on the right, and the hundreds of acres of farmland and woods surrounding the house, she felt like she was really living her dream, even though the family didn't do any actual farming. But someday, Diane thought, maybe after the baby came, she'd leave the TV station to focus on her family and maybe even grow a few vegetables. But for now, all that would have to wait. It would be months and months before the baby arrived, and Diane had a lot of things she wanted to accomplish before then. So Diane, standing on her front stoop, took one more deep breath of clean country air, then she walked down the gravel driveway and hopped into her brand new Jeep Wagoneer. Diane then slowly drove down her long driveway, and when she reached the black mailbox at the end of the driveway, she turned right onto Divison Drive, the street she'd called home for more than a year now. And from there, she snaked her way through the neighborhood out to the highway. About 20 minutes later, Diane was sitting behind her desk, diving into yet another busy day of reading the news. Most days, when Diane arrived at the office, the first thing she would do is review her scripts for the day. Then she would anchor the morning news show, and then Diane and her staff would spend the rest of the day reporting and writing stories for future news segments. Diane worked a lot, and she worked really hard. She was actually a perfectionist, and she expected perfection from the people around her. And sometimes that perfectionism rubbed her colleagues the wrong way. But the people who actually watched her on TV, the audience, loved her. Diane was constantly being invited to meet local celebrities and attend different charity events around town. But despite how well things seemed to be going both professionally and personally for Diane, something very unusual would start to happen to her, and it would change her life forever. It all started with a phone call. Diane was at the office, sitting behind her desk, working on a story, when her phone rang. Now, remember, this was 1990, so Diane did not have a cell phone or even caller ID. All she had was a landline. So Diane's phone began to ring, and without hesitation, Diane picked it up because the people who typically called her on this line were her colleagues or sources or people who knew her personally. But this day, the caller was not any of those things. Instead, the caller was a fan. Diane didn't ask the caller what their name was, but based on their voice, Diane guessed that the caller was a male, probably in his 20s or 30s. He said he had been watching Diane on TV, and he was so inspired by her reporting, he was thinking about getting into broadcasting himself, and he wanted to know if Diane had any advice about how to break into the business. Diane was caught off guard that this guy got her number, but she was polite and professional, and ultimately recommended that he get enrolled in the communications department at the local community college. Diane even recommended specific classes she thought he should take. The fan thanked Diane for her time, and she wished him luck in his professional efforts, and then she hung up the phone, expecting never to hear from this guy again. But Diane would hear from him again. The fan started calling Diane's direct line on her desk on a very regular basis, sometimes as often as 3 times in a single week. And again, because Diane didn't have caller ID, she just kept answering his calls unintentionally. Despite being really annoyed by all these calls, Diane still remained very professional with the fan and continued to give him advice about how to do her job. However, the more he called, the more Diane sensed there was just something off about the guy. For one thing, she started to suspect that he wasn't actually interested in pursuing journalism. The questions he asked her didn't feel like the kind of questions you would expect from someone who was looking for guidance or information or even mentorship. They felt like an excuse to contact her, like he was making up questions just so that he could listen to her answer them. And there was something else that seemed kind of creepy. The more Diane heard from this guy, the more she noticed he had this very strange way of talking. It was slow and kind of slurred, almost like he was under the influence of some drug. Now, nothing this guy said to her was ever overtly rude or threatening, but after several calls, Diane couldn't help feeling like this guy could be a danger to her, and she had good reason to feel that way. For the last 2 years, every supermarket tabloid in the country had been running these stories about the rise in celebrity stalking cases. And now, the problem had gotten so serious that even the legitimate newspapers were covering these stories too. There were stories about celebrities getting threatening letters, and stories about their homes getting broken into, and some of these stories ended violently. Just 1 year earlier, an obsessed fan in Los Angeles, California, had shot and killed a young television actress on the doorstep of her own apartment. And it wasn't just the media that saw these stalking cases as being a big problem. Slowly, the government was also starting to realize that something had to be done. The problem was, nobody really knew what to do about it. In the 1990s, there were no anti-stalking laws anywhere in the country, and neither psychologists nor law enforcement could say for sure if it was better to confront a stalker head-on or simply ignore them. Diane wasn't sure if her situation with her fan would be considered a celebrity stalking case, but she was definitely feeling a bit scared of this guy and just wished he would leave her alone. So Diane consulted with the people closest to her, and everybody offered her different advice. One of her friends told her to be nice to the guy because who knows what would happen if she made him mad. One of her colleagues suggested that Diane just tell the guy to back off, but Diane could see that there was potential for problems in both of those situations. So Diane turned to Brad, her husband, not only because he was smart and an objective thinker, but also because, in addition to being a part-time professor of criminal justice, Brad also used to be a police officer. Brad, who was very concerned about his wife's stalking situation, told her that the safest thing she could do was simply cut off the guy's access to her. And the easiest way to do that was to set up some kind of arrangement with the receptionist at her work who could then screen Diane's calls. If the guy couldn't get through to Diane, eventually, Brad figured, he would just give up and stop calling. The plan made sense to Brad and to Diane, so she decided to give it a shot. Diane talked to the receptionist at the TV station, and they worked out a screening system. The way it worked was every call that came in on Diane's direct line would actually first ring at the front desk with the receptionist, and the receptionist would answer the phone, and if it was Brad or a colleague or a source calling for Diane, they would get pushed through. But when the receptionist got a call from the fan with the slow, slurred voice, she would tell him that Diane was not available. And the screening system worked great for several weeks. The fan would call and would be immediately turned away before Diane ever had to speak to him. But eventually, the screening system failed. One afternoon, around the end of the summer in 1990, Diane was in the newsroom sitting at her desk filing some papers when her direct landline on her desk started to ring. Diane picked it up before the end of the very first ring. She said, "Hello, this is Diane Newton King." And when she heard the voice on the other end of the line, she was so startled she almost dropped the receiver. It was the fan. He said, "Hello, Diane." Immediately, shivers ran up Diane's spine. Before Diane could hang up, the guy told Diane that he liked the way she looked and that he wanted to meet her in person. Specifically, he said, "I want to go to lunch with you." Diane wanted to scream, but she was so flustered and so scared that she sort of just started stammering until finally she was able to compose herself enough to tell the guy that she appreciated the offer, but she absolutely could not meet him in person. Then she slammed the phone down and started sobbing at her desk. As she cried, everybody in the newsroom looked over and was very concerned. That night, when Diane came home, she told Brad about what happened that day, and Brad was livid. How could this guy get through to her phone? Why didn't the receptionist screen the call? Brad called the station and demanded answers, but no one at the station, including the receptionist, had any idea how this guy got through to Diane. The station told Brad they would look into the situation right away and make sure that from now on, absolutely no calls whatsoever would reach Diane's line unless they had first been screened. Now, it's unclear exactly what the station actually did to ensure that, but from that day forward, the fans' calls were always intercepted by someone at the station, and so Diane was protected from speaking with him. And after a couple of weeks, the fans' calls to the station started to slow down. And after a couple of months, the calls stopped entirely. And soon, Diane just kind of forgot about the fan and moved on to more important things in her life, like the upcoming arrival of her second child, a baby girl. And with this child, Diane was becoming more and more conflicted about what she wanted in life. Suddenly, her career just felt a whole lot less important than being home with her kids. And so she started talking more openly with her family and friends about potentially leaving the station after her daughter was born so she could be a stay-at-home mom and enjoy a simple farmhouse life with her family. But all of that excitement and optimism about the future would come to an abrupt end one night in the fall of 1990. On the night before Halloween that year, so about 5 months after the first fan phone call, Brad told Diane that he was going to be working late that night at the university and so wouldn't be home until later in the evening, which meant Diane would have to be on primary parent duty for Marlar that afternoon when she got home from work. Now, under normal circumstances, this would not be a big deal. Diane had done plenty of parenting on her own, and she loved spending time with Marlar. What made this night so different was that Diane was now 8 months pregnant. Her belly was massive, her hormones were raging, and her joints hurt so much she could barely walk. On top of all of that, Diane was in the middle of a big project at work that was totally stressing her out. Nevertheless, when she finished her shift at the station that day, Diane drove to Marlar's daycare, she picked him up, and then they headed home. By the time Diane turned onto her street, Divison Drive, Marlar was already passed out in the back of the car in his car seat, and Diane's body was really starting to ache. So when Diane turned into her driveway, instead of stopping the car and getting out to get the mail in the mailbox by the road, she simply pulled the car right up alongside the mailbox and reached out and collected the mail through her window. And after she had the stack of letters sitting on her lap, she began flipping through them. And right away, one letter caught her attention. It was in a typical white envelope, just like most of the other letters in her lap, but this one had no postage and nothing written on it, and it wasn't sealed. Diane opened the envelope, retrieved the letter inside, and then opened it up to read. And what she saw instantly terrified her. There was just one sentence on the page, but it wasn't written by hand. Each letter of this sentence had been cut out of a magazine and then scotch taped to the page, like one of those ransom letters you see in the movies. The sentence on this strange letter read, "You should have gone to lunch with me." Diane knew immediately that this letter was from the fan. Clearly, he'd found out where she lived, and he'd visited her house that day to drop it off. In fact, she realized with sudden alarm that this guy might actually still be in the area, waiting for her to come home. In that moment, Diane forgot about everything else she had going on. She forgot about how much her body hurt and how tired she felt. She even forgot about the sleeping baby sitting right behind her. Diane just started screaming like a banshee. Then she threw the car into reverse, backed away from the mailbox, slammed on the gas, and drove away from her house as fast as she possibly could. About 15 minutes later, Diane showed up at her friend Cindy Acosta's house. Diane and Cindy worked together at the TV station, and Cindy was one of the first people Diane had reached out to for advice when this fan started calling her. When Cindy opened the door, Diane, who was carrying Marlar, practically collapsed into Cindy's arms. In between sobs, Diane told Cindy about this letter and how scared she was, and right away, Cindy said, "We have to call the police." The police showed up a few minutes later and escorted Diane back to the farmhouse to search the property for intruders, but they didn't find anyone. Still, Diane was too afraid to stay at the house alone, so the police brought her back to Cindy's house, where she waited with Marlar until Brad was finally out of his class and could come and pick them up. After word got out about this threatening letter, the Battle Creek community really came together to support Diane. Also, the TV station beefed up their security around the office, Diane's sister bought them a dog, and Brad installed motion-censored lighting outside of their house. But none of those things actually made Diane feel any safer. She just couldn't shake the idea that her fan was watching her everywhere she went. Her fear got so paralyzing that Diane literally just stopped going outside the house at all except to go to work. And when she did have to go outside, she used a system that she and Brad created to ensure she was never outside alone. Diane would call Brad to tell him exactly when she would be home from work. That way, when she arrived, Brad would be outside waiting for her. If it was too cold for Brad to just stand outside, he would leave a particular light on in the house that was visible from the outside. This light was a signal to Diane that he was in the house and that everything was safe, so she could hustle out of her car and come inside no problem. On days that Brad was not home, when Diane returned home, she would call a neighbor to come meet her outside of her farmhouse. And if for some reason the neighbor arrived late, Diane would literally just sit in her driveway inside her car, waiting for the neighbor to show up. But all of this fear and all of this hiding had started to make Diane's world feel very small, and she really didn't like that. So after Diane gave birth to her second child, a blonde baby girl named Kateri, in November of 1990, Diane started trying to reconnect with her extended family. She started calling her sisters and mother much more often, and together, over the phone, the women would bond over the challenges and joys of raising their kids. And it was during this time, on these phone calls, that Diane started to talk more openly about her desire to leave the TV station altogether. She'd been thinking about it ever since she found out she was pregnant with Kateri, and now that Kateri was here, the whole thing felt much more real. Diane's extended family was very supportive and encouraging, and they pushed her to start leaving the house more often besides just going to work. They got her to start coming out to Detroit, where her extended family all lived, about 2 hours away from Battle Creek by car, so that she and her kids and the rest of the family could all participate more actively in each other's lives. And so, starting in late 1990/early 1991, every few weeks, after delivering the Thursday morning news break, Diane and her two kids would leave Battle Creek and head out to Detroit. They'd spend a few days with Diane's mother and sisters, and then on that following Saturday, they'd all head home. And on the night of Saturday, February 9th, 1991, about 9 months after the first call from that fan, this was exactly what Diane and the kids were doing, returning from her mother's. That night, Diane left Detroit a little after 4 p.m. So by the time she was pulling on to Divison Drive around 6 p.m., the sun was just beginning to set. Diane turned on her headlights, and when the King's black mailbox came into view, Diane tightened her grip around the steering wheel. It had been more than 3 months since she received the letter, but just the sight of that mailbox still filled her with dread. Diane turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the house, and as she made her way up the long, narrow path, she spotted the signal light on inside the farmhouse up ahead. meaning Brad was home and everything was safe and she could get out of her car and just go inside. But, as Diane was about to find out, Brad was not inside the house, and it was definitely not safe for Diane to get out of the car. About 30 minutes after Diane pulled into the driveway and saw the signal light, a call came into the dispatch office at the local police department. It was Brad, and he was hysterical. He was so shaken up by what he had just seen that he could barely form a sentence. But he was able to eventually communicate with the dispatcher that he'd just found his wife lying in their driveway, not moving, and there was blood in her mouth. When the police arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found Brad sobbing and pacing around the driveway. Diane was just lying in the middle of the driveway next to her car, and their two kids, 2-year-old Marler and 3-month-old Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of the car, crying uncontrollably. The reason Brad had left them in the car was because, as cruel as it seems, Brad knew from his work as a cop and as a criminal justice professor that even just opening the door to the car could potentially contaminate a crime scene. The responding officer walked right up to Diane and knelt down next to her. Even without much blood, it was obvious that Diane had suffered some sort of horrible injury and was definitely deceased. The officer spent a few minutes looking her over and eventually found the likely cause of death. There were 2 bullet holes in her body, one in her chest and the other near her waistline. An autopsy would later reveal that the shot to Diane's chest had been the fatal one. It had caused so much internal damage that she had died within 3 minutes of impact. Initially, though, the police had no idea how long ago those shots had been fired. But when the officer touched Diane's body, he found that it was still warm, which meant her killer might still be in the area. Instinctively, the officer grabbed his radio and called for backup. Over the next 2 hours, a small army of investigators would descend on Divison Drive. They would search the property for fingerprints and evidence, and they would interview neighbors and potential witnesses, and after a little while, they would bring one of the best trackers in the state onto the property, a German Shepherd named Travis. When Travis arrived on the scene, the dog quickly locked onto a scent trail. The dog took off running from the farmhouse straight back into the forest behind the home. The dog ran through muddy, brushy fields, then he crossed a creek, and then he sort of just stopped, turned around, and headed back to the farmhouse, where a crowd of investigators and neighbors were beginning to form outside. At the time, Travis's handler assumed that the dog had just kind of lost the scent at some point in the woods, and that was why he had stopped, turned around, and just gone back to the farmhouse. But many months after that night, once the police had figured out what happened to Diane, they would look back at Travis's initial movements that night and realize the dog had not simply given up and returned to the farmhouse. The dog had just continued to follow the scent trail, which happened to stop somewhere in the middle of the woods, turn around, and then come back to the farmhouse. In fact, that night that Diane was discovered, the killer was standing right outside of Diane and Brad's home among the police and onlookers. After being arrested, Diane's killer did not confess to the murder, and so we don't have every detail of what happened in the final moments of Diane's life. However, based on several key interviews and pieces of evidence, this is what investigators believe happened to Diane. About an hour before Diane returned home from Detroit on the night she was killed, Diane's killer entered her farmhouse and turned on a particular light inside. The killer knew about the light signal system that Brad and Diane had created to make Diane feel safe, and now the killer was going to use that system to lure Diane into a trap. After switching the signal light on, the killer walked back outside and headed for the old red and white Victorian barn, which was situated in front of Diane and Brad's property, just to the left of the gravel driveway. There was no light in the old barn, but it didn't matter. The killer had been on this property many times in the past and had even practiced this particular route in the darkness when no one else was home. Inside the barn, the killer walked past the family's tractor and the many tools they left lying on the ground. The killer walked past the family's protection dog, but the dog just kind of looked up and didn't even bark. And then the killer reached the back of the barn and climbed a narrow staircase which led to a large, dusty loft area. The killer paused briefly at the top of the stairs. The floor of the loft was covered in straw, and at the far end of the loft, away from the killer, was a sliding door that was open just wide enough for what the killer needed to do. The killer walked over to this slightly open door and peered outside. From there, they could see the front of the farmhouse and the driveway and the spot where Diane parked her car, which was about 70 feet away. The killer checked their watch. It was getting late, which meant Diane would be arriving soon. So the killer got into position. The killer lay belly down in the straw facing the gap in the door, and then they reached out their arm to the right and stuffed their hand into some nearby straw. A moment later, they pulled out a weapon that had been hidden inside the straw, a .22 caliber rifle. About 20 minutes later, the killer spotted a pair of headlights coming down Divison Drive. The killer raised their rifle and looked through the scope, and sure enough, Diane was sitting behind the wheel of this car. As she turned onto her long gravel driveway, the killer flicked the rifle off safe. The killer held Diane in their sights as she drove up the driveway to the house. And when she got close enough that the killer could hear the gravel under her tires, the killer slipped their finger over the trigger. Diane reached her normal parking spot located off to one side of the driveway close to the house, and then she turned the car off. As she gathered her things inside of the car, the killer pushed the rifle's barrel through the small opening in the sliding door and focused their sights on Diane's car door. A moment later, that door opened up and Diane stepped out onto the driveway. The killer paused for a second, taking in the sight of the woman they had terrorized for months and months, calling her over and over and over again at work, and then leaving her that threatening letter in her mailbox. Then, the obsessed fan / Diane's killer squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit Diane squarely in the chest, throwing her body backwards onto the ground and tearing through her insides. After watching her fall to the ground, the killer quickly got up and, with the rifle in his hand, hustled back to the stairs, climbed down to the first floor of the barn, and then marched outside over to Diane's body. Everything was going exactly to plan until the killer spotted something he did not expect to see. Diane's two kids, Marler and Kateri, were still sitting in the back seat of her car. The killer began to panic. Why were the kids here? The killer was certain Diane's plan had been to leave her kids in Detroit for the weekend with her grandmother. But, as the police would later discover, the arrangements for the kids were changed at the last minute because one of the kids had gotten sick while they were at Diane's mom's house, so Diane just brought the kids home with her. But for Diane's killer, the kids presented a huge problem, because after killing Diane, the killer had planned to drive away, get rid of the gun, and then try to establish some kind of alibi before Diane was discovered. But now there were these two kids in this car without heat in the middle of winter in freezing cold Michigan, and so if the killer left, the kids would freeze to death, and the killer was not trying to kill anyone except for Diane. So the killer changed plans. First, he turned away from the kids, crouched down, and then fired an additional shot into Diane's body to make sure she was dead. This was the shot that tore into her waistline. Then the killer turned and ran into the forest behind the farmhouse and charged through muddy, brushy fields across a creek to a spot where they were able to hide the rifle, and then the killer turned back around and ran back to the driveway of the King's house. When the killer got there, they ran up to the car window and looked inside and waved to the two kids and said, "Everything's gonna be fine, okay? Daddy's here. I'm gonna make a phone call and then I'll be right back." Then, Brad King, aka Diane's obsessed fan, aka Diane's killer, ran inside of his house that he shared with Diane and called the police. When they answered, Brad hysterically told him that he had just been out for a walk in the woods, and when he came back, he had found his poor wife lying in the driveway, not moving. It would turn out Brad King had been obsessed with Diane ever since the first day he met her. She was beautiful and funny and more ambitious than anyone Brad had ever met. Diane dreamed of becoming a news anchor, and Brad wanted to help make Diane's dreams come true. So, while Diane was off working her way up to the news desk, Brad spent most of his time working to make sure she had everything she needed to be successful. He cooked Diane's meals and ironed her clothes, he handled the shopping, and when the kids came along, Brad took care of them too. And as far as Brad was concerned, everything was working out great. Until one day, when Diane came to him and told him that she wanted to quit her job at the TV station so that she could stay home and raise the kids. In fact, she told him she was planning to leave the station the summer after Kateri was born. Diane hadn't formalized this announcement yet, but pretty much everyone in Diane's inner circle knew about her plans. But the problem was, if Diane was going to stay home, then Brad would have to be the family's primary breadwinner, and being a part-time professor just wasn't going to cut it. He would have to go out and find a full-time job, which was something Brad simply didn't want to do. He had grown to love not working very much, and he was not prepared to change that. However, when Brad voiced his concern to Diane about not wanting to work full-time, she was empathetic, but said it was really important for her and the kids that she be home with them, so he would just have to kind of accept it and get a full-time job. However, Brad did not accept this. Instead, he decided he would just kill Diane. And because of his background as a police officer and as a criminal justice professor, he was confident he could get away with it. Brad knew that whenever a woman got murdered, the male partner is almost always identified as a primary suspect. So Brad knew he would need to create another suspect to divert attention away from himself. This is when Brad came up with this obsessed fan concept. About 10 months before Diane's murder, Brad began calling Diane's TV station, pretending to be this obsessed fan. He would intentionally slur words and slow down his speech to make sure Diane could not recognize him. Then, about 5 months after that first call, when by this point everybody in town knew about Diane's stalker, Brad decided to up the ante. On the night before Halloween, Brad left that threatening letter in the mailbox. He used cutout letters so Diane could not identify his handwriting, and he did it because he knew that type of letter would be more intimidating because of its use in scary movies. And the letter worked. It terrified Diane, and most importantly, it brought more attention to this fake fan, to the point where the police were actively searching for this person. This obsessed fan had become so real that by the time Brad was ready to kill his wife, he felt certain that nobody would even look twice at him. But thanks to his kids still being in the car after he killed Diane, Brad had not been able to flee the scene like he had hoped, and so he had to come up with a story about how he had been walking in the woods that night and had returned home and came upon his wife in the driveway, and that's when he called police. But this story didn't make sense. Police discovered that Brad would have known exactly what time Diane was coming home that night because Diane's mom had called Brad and told him when Diane had left her house. And based on the system that he and Diane had, Brad would have known that Diane would have expected him to be at their house waiting for her when she arrived. So why would Brad choose to be out on a walk in the woods at the exact moment Diane was arriving home? Also, neighbors had just seen Brad carrying the .22 caliber rifle that was used to kill Diane. The gun was located in the creek behind their house, roughly where Travis the tracking dog had gone on the first night of the investigation. And in the barn, police also found a single shell casing from the shot that killed Diane. On December 13th, 1992, Brad was convicted of murdering his wife, Diane. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never showed any remorse for her murder. Diane was buried in Detroit, near where her family lived. On her headstone, it says, "Beloved daughter, sister, mother." Diane was also, of course, a wife, but her family decided not to include that word. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the Amazon Music follow button cleans their house, make sure you sneak in afterward and untuck all of their bed sheets. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In December of 2005, a young woman walked down a sidewalk in New York City. There were Christmas decorations on all the buildings and Christmas lights. It was very festive. But as she walked along, she glanced over at a newspaper stand, and she saw something on the front page of that paper that literally made her stop in her tracks, and not because it was festive. It was awful. Right there on the front page was a picture of the one thing in her life that she'd hoped she would never, ever see again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, on the next extremely hot day, sneak into the Follow Button's house and jack their thermostat all the way up to the highest possible setting, then go ahead and just rip the thermostat out of the wall and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the evening of Sunday, November 27, 2005, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Woods leaned towards the mirror to put on her eyeliner inside the bathroom of her small apartment in New York City. Catherine's phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, and she heard it buzz, but she didn't even look to see who was calling. She didn't have time to talk to anyone, because she had to finish getting ready for her 7 o'clock shift at work. So Catherine had moved to New York City from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dream of becoming a dancer on Broadway. But everything here was so expensive that in addition to chasing her dream, she also had to work 3 different jobs just to make ends meet. Now, 2 of those jobs were pretty standard. She worked as a waitress and also taught children's dance classes. But tonight, she was getting ready to go to her 3rd job, and this job was not really standard at all. In fact, to her, she was sort of embarrassed about it. And because of that, she was keeping it a secret from almost everybody in her life. Her 3rd job was working as a topless dancer at a strip club near Times Square called Flash Dancers. Catherine honestly hated the work, but it paid really well, and if she wanted to have her shot at Broadway, she needed to pay for voice lessons and dance classes. Now, she did live in Manhattan, which was the most expensive part of the already very expensive city, and she knew that she could save some money if she just moved to a neighborhood where rent was cheaper. But when she had first moved to New York, she had lived in a less expensive neighborhood for that reason, and unfortunately, her landlord had sexually assaulted her. The experience had been so traumatic that Catherine had, at the time, considered just leaving New York and going back to Ohio and just being done with this place. But in the end, she had decided to stay in New York and continue chasing her dream. Now, she did move within New York. She'd gotten this apartment in Manhattan because it was a lot safer, and she also got a roommate to help with the cost. His name was David Hahn, he was 23, and he was one of Catherine's friends from back home in Ohio. But at this very moment, David was not inside the apartment. He'd gone outside to get his car so he could drive Catherine to work. Catherine finished her makeup and left the bathroom, and as she walked through the living room, she stepped over a black dog that was sleeping on the floor. The dog was not Catherine's, and it actually was not David's either. David was a part-time dog sitter, so this dog was just staying with them while its owners were out of town. Just like Catherine, David also had a bunch of part-time jobs to help make ends meet. When he wasn't dog sitting, he worked as a doorman at a hotel just up the street from their apartment. Now, Catherine and David had actually been romantic at one point. They had dated for a little while, but these days they were just roommates, living together to split the bills. Although, secretly, Catherine did sometimes wonder if, maybe they should give it another shot to try being a couple again. Thanksgiving had been a few days ago, and instead of going home to Ohio like she usually did, Catherine had stayed in New York and celebrated with David, and it had been a really nice time. Plus, David knew about Catherine's 3rd job of working at Flash Dancers, and he didn't judge her for it, and Catherine felt like a lot of people did, so she liked that about him. But the biggest hurdle that Catherine could see to potentially rekindling their relationship was the fact that David disliked basically every man she met, whether she was dating them or not. He just did not like them. Now, some of these guys, she could understand why David, didn't like them. Like there was this guy, Joe, that she had dated briefly, who really she'd only met because he was a patron of her strip club. But then there were people like Paul, who was a personal trainer at Catherine's gym, who she'd only seen off and on, and who was nothing but nice to David. And even though Paul and Catherine were not dating now and mostly just spoke on the phone periodically, David still insisted that Paul was a creep. He just did not like the guy. But for now, Catherine figured, you know what, I'm not going to figure out my entire romantic life. I just need to finish getting ready and go downstairs so she wouldn't keep David waiting. So Catherine went into her bedroom and began getting dressed. And that's when she heard that dog start barking at something in the living room. And so, curious, Catherine walked in that direction to see what was going on. A little while later, Catherine's roommate, David, walked quickly along the sidewalk to get his car, which was parked a ways up the street. He was out of breath by the time he reached it. He knew he had to hurry, so he jumped in and he drove back to the apartment building and he called Catherine as he pulled up out front. When she didn't answer, he threw on his hazards and he climbed back out to go into the building to go get her. And he had just made it up the flight of stairs that led to his second floor apartment and he was going down the hallway when he saw something that made him come to an abrupt stop. It was that black dog that he was dog sitting. Somehow it had gotten out of the apartment and was just standing there in the shared hallway outside of his apartment door. David blinked and then realized that his neighbor, a man he rarely interacted with named Brad Stewart, was standing right behind the dog. And Brad was holding a leash that was clearly clipped onto the dog's collar. For a second, Brad looked surprised, and David was just completely confused about why this guy had the dog that he was dog sitting on a leash. But then Brad told David that he had found the dog wandering around, recognized it as David's, and brought it back to his apartment. Brad said he had just knocked on David's apartment door, but so far nobody had answered. So at this point, David understood, why Brad has the dog, but he didn't know why the dog was out of the apartment in the first place. But he kept that to himself and just thanked Brad, took the leash, and then stepped over to the door of his apartment, number 2D. The apartment door was shut, but when he turned the handle, he found that it was unlocked. David couldn't remember if he had left it unlocked or not, so he just opened it, and he called out Catherine's name. But there was no answer, which was weird, so he stepped inside. Now, he didn't see Catherine, but he did see the door to her bedroom was slightly cracked open, so he walked over to it, and he called out to her again. And then when she didn't call back, he tried pushing her door open. But the door didn't really open. It instead swung maybe a few inches and then stopped. And David felt resistance on the other side, like something maybe on the ground was holding the door from opening all the way. And so now, with all these strange things happening, David's starting to feel pretty worried. And so the surge of adrenaline came over him, and he just shoved the door open, and he stuck his head in, and he looked inside. And when he saw what was in there, he immediately pulled back, turned around, ran into the hallway, and he called the police. A half an hour later, around 7:30 p.m., an NYPD detective named Stephen Getz walked up a flight of stairs at an apartment building in Manhattan. This part of the city was known to be extremely safe. Homicides never really happened here. But if the 911 caller had been telling the truth, Getz knew that a potential grisly murder scene was in fact waiting for him in apartment 2D. When he reached the second floor landing, he saw there were already a few other NYPD officers on the scene, and one of them was speaking to this young, skinny guy standing in the hallway who looked really upset, and he was holding a leash that was connected to a black dog. Another officer walked over to Getz and filled him in. He said the man that was being spoken to was the victim's roommate, David Hahn, and he was the one who had found the body and called 911. The victim, Catherine Woods, was inside the apartment in the back bedroom. Getz nodded and then walked down the hallway, past David and the dog, toward the apartment door. His plan was to look at the scene himself before he began questioning anyone. Getz put on some disposable rubber gloves and checked out the door frame to the actual apartment, and then he also looked at the door itself. But he didn't see any damage that could signify forced entry. So he stepped into the apartment, and he saw that the small living room was a little bit messy. But it wasn't like it had been ransacked or something. The futon was pulled out, and there were some men's clothes strewn around, but it sort of looked like a typical place that people lived. And so Getz walked through the living room, being careful not to disturb anything, and he went towards what he assumed was the bedroom, where the body was. The door was open just wide enough that Getz was able to get through. And when he stepped through and was inside the room, he saw blood everywhere. It was all over the walls and the furniture, and the room itself looked like it had been completely torn apart. One of the dresser drawers was open, and lots of women's clothing was scattered all over the place, and the mattress had been completely taken off the bed frame and was now lying on the floor, and that's actually what was blocking the door from opening all the way. And then, in the middle of the room, in a pool of blood, lay the body of a young woman. Getz knew from the 911 call that her name was Catherine Woods. He walked over and squatted down next to her for a closer look. She was wearing a t-shirt and underwear, and the t-shirt had a very obvious shoe print on it, like whoever had killed Catherine had stepped on her. And there were at least a dozen stab wounds all over her body. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds on her hands and arms. which Getz knew meant she must have fought back against her attacker. But the worst injuries she sustained were definitely to her neck. Whoever had killed her had slit her throat so deeply that they had almost decapitated her. And so to Getz, right away, it seemed like whoever killed Catherine had been in an absolute rage. At that point, Getz heard footsteps coming from behind him, and he stood up and he turned around to see that the NYPD forensics team had arrived. Now, the blocked door was making maneuvering in and out of this bedroom pretty difficult, so one of the first things the forensics team did was to pick up the mattress and carefully lean it against the wall, so the bedroom door could now swing open all the way. Then Detective Getz just stepped back and let the forensics team get to work. He watched as they pulled that shoe print off the t-shirt Catherine was wearing, and then also there was a second identical shoe print that was on her bed sheets that they also grabbed. To Getz, both of these prints did appear to be from the exact same shoe, and to the naked eye, these prints appeared, at least to Getz, to belong to very likely an average-sized man. Detective Getz was immediately curious about something, so he stepped out of the bedroom into the living room, and he quickly found a couple pairs of men's shoes lying on the floor. And although the tread of these shoes did not match the prints he had just seen in the bedroom, they did appear to be the exact same size. An hour later, at about 8:30 p.m. on November 27, 2005, Detective Getz sat down at a table inside of an interview room at the NYPD's 19th Precinct. And once he did, he handed a bottle of water across the table to David Hahn, the roommate of the murder victim, and Detective Getz' current number one suspect. There had been no sign of forced entry at the apartment that David and Catherine shared, which meant that Catherine's killer either had access to the apartment or was let inside by somebody who did. And the murder had been committed with a knife in a really savage way that struck Getz as being a personally motivated attack. Even though Catherine's bedroom had been trashed, nothing seemed to have been stolen, and because Catherine had been found partially undressed, there was potentially a sexual motive at play as well. So Getz's working theory here was that this murder was committed by a man who knew the victim well and had easy access to her living space. And David fit that profile to a T. Plus, he apparently wore the same size shoe as the killer. Although, as Detective Getz settled into his chair and brought out his notepad, he did a quick scan of David's forearms and his hands, and he saw that David had no visible cuts, scrapes, or bruises. The detective thought that Catherine's killer likely would have some injuries there because she had obviously been fighting for her life. She would have left a mark on them. But Getz didn't say anything about this to David. Instead, he just leaned forward and he asked David to walk him through what had happened that day. David's hands were shaking a bit, but he took a deep breath to calm himself, and he said that he had been at the apartment with Catherine that night until about 6:40 p.m. That was when he had left to go get his car so he could come back and drive Catherine to her 7 o'clock shift at Flash Dancers. But he said retrieving his car had taken longer than he expected, because on the way, he had run into some of his coworkers from his doorman job, and he had stopped to chat with them. He said after he had done that and he had gotten his car and he went back to the apartment, he had expected Catherine to be waiting outside by the curb. But when he got there, there was no sign of her, and she didn't answer when he called her. So David said he'd ultimately gone inside and ran upstairs to the apartment, and in the hallway he had found his neighbor, Brad, who was oddly holding the leash of the black dog that David was supposed to be looking after, and then David said he went into his apartment, and that's when he found Catherine's body. David said he had called 911 right away. It was right around 7 p.m. And at this, Getz stopped writing on the notepad and just looked up at David. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. David was claiming that he'd only been out of the apartment for 20 minutes, and that in that narrow window of time, Catherine had been brutally murdered and the killer had also escaped. It honestly sounded like one of the worst alibis Getz had ever heard. But he didn't want David to know just how close he was to getting arrested for murder, because he didn't want David to get scared and stop talking. So Getz kept his tone very sympathetic as he asked how long David had known Catherine for. David said they had met back in Ohio a few years ago while Catherine was visiting her hometown. They'd begun dating, and he had ultimately moved out to New York to live with her. But it wasn't long before Catherine broke up with him and then asked him to move out. But David said he had not been able to afford his own place, so he had started sleeping in his car. And Catherine had felt bad about that, so she had ultimately let him move back in on the condition that he slept on the futon out in the living room. By now, Detective Getz's pen was flying across the page, because David was not just Catherine's roommate, he was her ex-boyfriend. an ex-boyfriend who was the last person to see Catherine alive and discovered her body. Getz was more confident than ever that he was sitting across from Catherine's killer. He told David that everything he was saying was incredibly helpful, but right now, he needed to go check on something. David agreed to wait, and Getz stood up to leave. But he stopped at the door, and he asked David for one last thing before he left. He asked what his shoe size was. And without missing a beat, David answered that he wore a 10.5. Getz jotted this down, and then he left. What he hadn't told David was the reason he was stepping out of the room was to go get some information from the NYPD's forensics team and the uniformed officers who were currently questioning David's neighbors. And once Getz had that information, he was going to use it to try to catch David in a lie. About 19 hours later, so about 3 p.m. the next day, Getz was sitting at his desk feeling completely exhausted, but was pounding yet another cup of coffee. He'd been up all night interrogating David, who was still literally sitting right down the hall in the interrogation room. And also, Getz had been going back and forth with the forensics team and other officers and detectives who were out in the neighborhood, and he still had loads more to do before he could finally go to sleep. Right now, Getz was going over a new batch of reports from the uniformed officers who had gone door to door in Catherine and David's apartment building, asking the neighbors if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. And just like Getz had hoped, the information they were getting did contradict pieces of David's story. David claimed that he had left the apartment at about 6:40 p.m. and said that at that time, Catherine was fine. But 2 neighbors said they heard screams coming from the apartment before 6:40 p.m. The man in the unit directly above David and Catherine said he had heard 3 screams at 6:28 p.m. And the people in the unit next door to David and Catherine said they'd heard screaming, barking, and the sound of furniture moving around even earlier, between 5:45 and 6 p.m. Now, none of these neighbors had done anything about these noises because the noises had stopped pretty quickly. And then there was Brad Stewart, the neighbor who had said he had found the black dog. Brad told police that when he ran into David in the hallway, it was sometime between 6 and 6:30. But David had said that he went back up to the apartment and found Catherine's body at about 7 p.m., a full half hour later. Now, Getz knew witnesses were often bad with time, and in a dense New York City apartment building, there were lots of noises coming from lots of units, but still, it looked to him like David's alibi had serious problems. And so the detective sat back and had some more coffee, and then his phone rang. He picked it up, and it was the forensics team with an update about those shoe prints that were on Catherine's shirt and the bedsheets. And the prints were indeed left behind by a roughly average-sized man. They were a men's size 10.5. And this was the exact size Getz knew David wore. Getz thanked them, hung up the phone, and then rushed back to the interrogation room to have yet another chat with David Hahn. This time, though, Getz did not offer David a water. He just sat down and he confronted him with all these new facts. He told David that the killer's shoe prints were exactly his shoe size, that his neighbors had heard screams before David had supposedly left the building, and that Brad said he'd seen David in the hallway at least a half an hour earlier than David had claimed he was there. Getz leaned in and told David that there were also security cameras in the apartment building, and his officers were already in the process of getting access to that footage. So if David had anything to say, he better say it now. Getz watched as David's expression went from exhausted to clearly afraid. It seemed like this might be the first time that David realized the police truly did not believe his story. And after a second of just stunned silence, David insisted that he had not killed Catherine, and he begged Getz to believe him. But when Getz just glared back at him completely unmoved, David launched into a whole new story, one he had not mentioned at all over the last 20 hours of interrogation. David said Catherine knew this guy named Paul Cortez. She had dated him, but David had always thought he was kind of a creep. And David said Catherine had told him that Paul was obsessed with her. So David said the police really ought to go investigate Paul, not him. To Getz, this seemed like a desperate last-minute attempt to cast suspicion on somebody else. But he knew he did have to follow every lead, so he did write down Paul's name and told David they'd look into it. When Getz finally left the station for the evening, David was still in the interrogation room, and reporters from all the daily papers were beginning to assemble right outside. The following morning, the story of Catherine's murder and pictures of her smiling face were all over the news. The front page of the New York Daily News carried a headline that made Getz grimace. It read, "Secret Life of Slain Stripper." Inside, the article reported that Catherine's family hadn't known she was working as a topless dancer until they literally flew to the city from Ohio to collect her body. Getz skimmed the article at his desk. He wasn't convinced that Catherine's line of work had anything to do with her murder, but the papers seemed intent on running with it. And a media circus was like the last thing Getz wanted. His team was already under enough pressure to make an arrest as it was, and it was going to be even harder to do their jobs now that a bunch of tips were going to be flooding in from the public from all this media. Getz put down the newspaper, got up from his desk, and walked down the hall to the interrogation room. He'd finished the day yesterday feeling pretty confident that David was his murderer. So when he'd sent David home, he had given him instructions not to leave the city, because he intended to arrest David and soon. But first, Getz did need to follow up on the other leads he had, to hopefully rule them out. And one of those leads was sitting in the interrogation room right now waiting for him. It was Paul Cortez, the man that David had named, who officers had tracked down and brought in, the man who supposedly was obsessed with Catherine. As soon as Getz entered the room, the first thing he did was look at Paul's shoes, and he could see that they were a pretty typical size too. At a glance, they looked like they could also be a 10.5. Getz also looked for scratches or bruises on Paul's skin, in particular on his forearms and his hands. And he did see one. There was a small injury on one of Paul's fingertips. Getz asked about it, and Paul said his finger had just gotten pinched between a couple of weights at the gym. Paul was very calm and soft-spoken, and he said he'd heard all about Catherine's death in the papers, and he just wanted to help if he could. When Getz told him that they'd gotten his name from David Hahn, Paul just kind of rolled his eyes and said, David had always been jealous of his relationship with Catherine. Paul explained that he had met Catherine at the gym about a year ago, and they'd been dating off and on ever since. At the time of Catherine's death, he said they had been off, but Paul said he still cared about her and had hoped that maybe one day they might get back together. Paul told Getz that he hadn't actually seen Catherine on the day of her death, but that he had actually spoken to her on the phone earlier that afternoon, which was not unusual. The two did speak on the phone from time to time. That's all it was. Paul said he actually had tried calling her a second time that day, but she didn't answer. But Paul said he really didn't think much of it. And then Paul said that night he wound up going shopping with some friends and then also to a local bar to watch the Jets game at about 8:30. Getz made a note to follow up on Paul's alibi. Then he asked Paul if he had any idea who might have killed Catherine. Paul thought for a moment, and then his eyes lit up, and he said there had been some stalker guy named Joe who'd been one of Catherine's regulars at the strip club. Months ago, he'd somehow gotten Catherine's phone number and had reached out to her outside of the club. And around that same time, Catherine had actually gotten roofied during one of her strip club shifts. A roofie is called the date rape drug. It basically makes you incapacitated and effectively unconscious. You don't remember anything. People will be given a roofie and then be sexually assaulted. That's often its use. And even though he'd never been able to prove this, Paul always suspected it had been Joe who gave Catherine that roofie. Catherine had cut off contact with Joe, but the whole incident had bothered Paul so much that he tried to convince Catherine to just quit the exotic dancing scene, but she refused. Paul admitted that he actually went on to call Catherine's father to tell him how worried he was about her. And Catherine had been so mad about that she stopped talking to Paul for weeks. And so Getz jotted all this down and then asked Paul if he knew how to get in touch with this guy Joe. Paul said he didn't have Joe's number, but it was definitely in Catherine's phone. Because the last time Paul ever spoke on the phone with Catherine, on the afternoon of her death, she had mentioned something that really surprised him. She said that after months of silence, Joe had started calling her again, completely out of the blue. And at this, Getz studied Paul's face, looking for any hint of deception. This whole Joe story seemed like it might just be a way to deflect suspicion from Paul himself. But it really didn't feel like Paul was lying here. And besides, Catherine's phone records would be simple enough to verify. Getz hated to admit it, but maybe the newspapers were right. Maybe it was time he started looking seriously into some of Catherine's customers at the strip club. The following afternoon, on Wednesday, November 30th, Detective Getz was feeling really annoyed as he hung up the phone at his desk. It had been a call from another reporter, but Getz hadn't made an arrest yet, so he was staying tight-lipped. But for now, he just turned his focus back to the stack of papers on his desk. They were Catherine's cell phone records, which he'd subpoenaed yesterday, and they showed that Paul had been telling the truth. Both he and Joe had called Catherine shortly before she died. So he'd brought in Joe for an interview, and he asked him to explain why, after months of silence, he had called Catherine right before she turned up dead. and Joe had replied he'd only called her to check in, to say he hoped she had a nice Thanksgiving. He had claimed that he was really just trying to be friendly. But then Getz just asked Joe point blank if he had ever roofied anyone's drink before. And at this, Joe's eyes went wide and he kind of sputtered out that he would never dream of doing anything like that. But based on Joe's tone, Getz really felt like he was lying. And so now, Getz felt like the entire investigation was wide open. A few days ago, he had been absolutely confident that David was the killer, but men from Catherine's life just kept coming out of the woodwork. He now had 3 main suspects instead of just 1. In fact, at this point, his original suspect, David, was actually looking more innocent. Getz's officers had spoken to David's coworkers at the hotel where he worked as a doorman, and they confirmed that he really had stopped and talked to them on the evening of Catherine's death, just like he had claimed. And while Getz had hoped that the security camera footage from the apartment building would prove David was lying about his alibi, at least in terms of when he was there, it actually showed David leaving the front entrance of the building at 6:38 p.m., which lined up with David's story because he said he left around 6:40. Now, this did not prove that David was innocent. Based on what the neighbors had heard, she could have been killed before 6:38, but there weren't a lot of cameras in the apartment building, and no angle covered the hallway outside of apartment 2D. So the footage couldn't prove one way or another, whether Brad Stewart or anybody else for that matter had gone into the apartment while David was gone. Just then, his phone rang. Getz reached for it, expecting it to be another reporter, but this time he was pleasantly surprised. It was a member of the forensics team, and there was this obvious excitement in their voice. He told Getz that they'd just discovered something big, something they completely missed during their first sweep of Catherine's apartment. The forensics team member explained that when they'd first entered Catherine's bedroom, they had taken that mattress that was stuck behind the door and propped it up against the wall to get it out of the way. But when they'd done that, the mattress had actually covered up something that was right there on the wall all along. A bloody handprint. It was not until a couple of days later, after they'd carefully gone over everything else in the room, that they moved the mattress back down onto the floor, and that's when they found the handprint. Getz's face lit up when he heard this news, because now he knew all he had to do was go get handprints from all of his suspects, which seemed like that would be pretty easy to do. But he quickly realized he had a problem, because some of his suspects had already lawyered up at this point, and they were refusing to speak with police, let alone hand over their prints. And Getz really could not force them to give their prints unless he arrested them. And so that meant Getz was now in this weird catch-22, because he needed the suspects' prints in order to make the arrest, but he also couldn't get their prints unless he arrested them. So at this point, the investigation kind of stalled out. Weeks went by, and Detective Getz started to get really frustrated because there was just nothing he could legally do to push the case forward. However, the case was still receiving a ton of coverage in the press, and to a lot of people, it looked like the NYPD was just sort of dropping the ball here. But then on December 16th, so 3 weeks after Catherine's murder, the news coverage that had annoyed Getz so much actually ended up giving him exactly what he needed. That day, a woman called the NYPD because of something she had seen on the front page of one of the newspapers in New York. And what this woman said led Getz directly to Catherine's killer. Based on forensic evidence and numerous interviews, this is what police believe happened to Catherine Woods on the evening of November 27, 2005. Shortly after 6:40 p.m., the killer climbed the stairs inside of Catherine's apartment building. They knew that at that very moment, she'd be getting ready for another shift at Flash Dancers. And the fact that she even worked there secretly really bothered the killer way more than they would ever let on. The idea of Catherine dancing and giving her attention to other men made the killer so jealous they couldn't even stand it. Now, the killer had tried to talk with Catherine and win her over, but she had rejected him. So the time for talking was over. And so the killer quietly walked up to the door of apartment 2D and reached down and turned the handle, which was unlocked. As they slipped silently into the apartment, the killer brought out the knife that they had hidden inside of their sweatshirt. But then something they had not anticipated happened. There was this dog lying on the apartment floor that got up and began to bark at them. For a moment, the killer thought about just abandoning the plan and leaving, but then Catherine, alerted by the dog, came out of the bedroom and looked right at the killer and saw the knife in their hand. Catherine screamed and ran right back into her bedroom, the very bedroom that she had made explicitly off limits to the killer,
And just thinking about that, the surge of anger suddenly overtook them, and the killer charged into the room after her. Catherine was already on the other side of the bed, lifting up the mattress as a sort of barricade. But the killer just forced their way past it, and they grabbed Catherine from behind. But Catherine, she fought back. She began thrashing around, doing everything she could to break free. But she couldn't. And so they struggled and began smashing into the furniture and knocking things down all over the room. And it was around this point that the killer lifted up that knife they had brought, and they slit her neck as deep as they could. But even then, even with this fatal wound, Catherine kept on fighting. And she was so vicious that the killer actually had to brace themselves against a wall just to keep their balance. And in the chaos, the killer didn't realize, as they're fighting off Catherine, that they had placed a bloody hand on the wall, leaving a print behind. Finally, when Catherine fell to the floor, the killer was still blinded with their rage, and they just got down there and began stabbing her over and over again. And then finally, when Catherine stopped moving, the killer just jumped up and ran out of the apartment. But when they got into the hallway, they realized that black dog that had barked at them had gotten out. Now, the killer wanted the dog back in the apartment, but the dog was clearly on edge. They were still barking at the killer. And so instead, the killer just shut the apartment door, trapping the dog in the hallway. And then the killer fled the apartment building out the back door, where there was no security camera. And for weeks, the killer was not caught, until their violent past came back to bite them. Several weeks after Catherine's murder, a young woman who didn't know Catherine was walking down the streets of New York when she noticed a newspaper. And on the cover of this newspaper was plastered the face of the killer, who was currently a suspect in a murder case. And this woman was horrified because she knew this person. They, the killer, had sexually assaulted her about a year earlier, but she had never filed a police report. But after seeing that this horrible person was being actively accused of murder, she called the NYPD and she told them what she knew. And the NYPD's Special Victims Unit used this woman's accusation as the basis to arrest the killer. And finally, once they were under arrest, Getz was able to get their handprint. And those prints did in fact match the bloody handprint found on Catherine's wall. They belonged to Catherine's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Paul Cortez. David's suspicions of Paul had been right all along. Paul was a creep who had assaulted at least one other woman before he killed Catherine. Data collected from nearby cell towers would prove that Paul was near Catherine's apartment building immediately before her murder, and he had been calling her over and over again. When she ignored his calls, Paul waited until he saw David leave the apartment to go get his car, and then he hustled upstairs to the apartment, knowing Catherine would be alone. Even though David was only gone for 20 minutes, that was still long enough for Paul to get inside the apartment, murder Catherine, and slip away unnoticed. Paul was arrested about a month after Catherine's murder on Wednesday, December 23, 2005. He was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At around 9 p.m. on September 13th, 2006, a college student walked toward her friend's apartment in the small town of Valley City, North Dakota. She walked up the steps and was about to knock on her friend's door when she was hit with this really powerful chemical smell, like cleaning chemicals. She looked around, wondering where the smell was coming from, and that's when she realized it was coming from her friend's apartment. More confused than worried, the friend knocked on the door, but there was no answer. So she reached down and tried the handle, and it was unlocked. So she opened it up, and when she looked inside, she began to scream. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the Amazon Music Follow Button's wedding and make sure to sneakily replace their first dance song with episode number 1 of our brand new show, Run Fool. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a bright, cool afternoon in early September of 2006, 22-year-old college senior Mindy Morgenstern walked out of her one-bedroom apartment in the small college town of Valley City, North Dakota. Mindy was tall and athletic, with curly black hair that came down to her shoulders. She wore a tank top, sweatpants, and running shoes. Mindy felt the sun beat down on her face as she carried her 2 empty laundry baskets down the steps outside of her second-floor apartment to the apartment complex's laundry room on the first floor. As Mindy got close to the laundry room, she heard 2 of the dryers buzzing. Mindy smiled. She'd clearly timed her trip perfectly. Mindy stepped into the cramped laundry room, pulled her clothes out of each dryer, and piled them into the baskets. Then she headed back towards her apartment. Mindy passed a young couple on the steps, and so she said hello and smiled. It was a pretty small apartment complex, and so Mindy made sure to be friendly to everyone she ran into there. In fact, most of her neighbors knew Mindy as the young woman who always had a smile on her face and a kind word to say. The couple said hello back to Mindy and smiled as well, and then Mindy continued the walk back up to her apartment. Mindy grabbed her key from her pocket and she tried to unlock the door, but she was really struggling to balance the laundry baskets in her arms as she tried to do this. At the same time, Mindy heard a voice behind her, and her neighbor, Mo Gibbs, swooped in and grabbed one of the baskets before it fell out of Mindy's arms. Mindy laughed at herself and then got the door open. She took the basket from Mo, thanked him for his help, and she went inside. Mindy put the baskets on the floor and pushed them up against the wall in the entryway. She knew she should probably just put her clothes away now, but she had some studying she wanted to finish first. So Mindy walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She reached over and grabbed a pen and a notebook from the coffee table, leaned back on the couch, and started reading through some notes on sports medicine that she'd taken for her class. In high school, Mindy had been a basketball star, and she had dreamed of playing in college, and maybe even professionally in the WNBA someday. But not long after her high school graduation, Mindy had unfortunately been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, or MS for short, is a chronic disease of the central nervous system that can affect a person's vision and movement and can cause fatigue and loss of balance. Since her diagnosis, Mindy had been doing well with treatment and medication, but the disease had forced her to give up playing basketball competitively. But as crushing as that was, Mindy had never let it get her down. She was a religious person who believed God had a plan for everybody, and so she had told herself that being a professional athlete just wasn't part of God's plan for her. But still, Mindy did love sports, and so she wanted to find another way to connect with athletics without actually participating in them. So she had spent her time in college studying to become a physical therapist someday, and she had also started working as an assistant coach for a high school basketball team in the area. In her living room, Mindy was going over her notes when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She put her notes down, grabbed her flip phone, and looked at the caller's number on the small digital display. Mindy took a deep breath. She really didn't want to talk to the person who was calling, but she thought it was rude not to answer. So, feeling resigned, she flipped open the phone and said hello, and she heard the voice of a man in his mid-50s on the other line. And before Mindy could get a word in after saying hello, the man said how excited he was that he'd caught her when she wasn't busy. The man on the other line was Rodney Kuznia, the father of Mindy's ex-boyfriend. Mindy and Rodney's son had broken up over a year ago, but when they were together, it had been very serious. Mindy had even thought they'd get married someday. But her boyfriend had moved to another city for college, and he had gotten tired of being in a long-distance relationship. So he had broken up with Mindy and stopped talking to her. But his father, Rodney, had stayed in Mindy's life. After the breakup, Rodney had called occasionally just to check in on Mindy. Mindy and Rodney had gotten to know each other pretty well when she was dating Rodney's son, so at first Mindy thought the calls were kind of nice, a father figure just making sure she was okay. But after a short time, it all kind of changed. Rodney had started calling several times a week, and Mindy just didn't really like it. Mindy's friends had told her she needed to cut Rodney off completely, just tell him to never call again, and if he did call, she needed to ignore it. Mindy hadn't gone that far, but she had told Rodney that he really needed to back off, and that it wasn't right that he kept calling her all the time. But Rodney clearly had not gotten the message. On this particular phone call, Rodney asked if maybe Mindy would want to get together for dinner sometime. When Mindy heard this, she just sighed. She could hear her friends' voices in her head. "You can't do this. Tell him to go away." Then, in a very calm, polite voice, Mindy told Rodney that she did not think that was a good idea, and she told him again that he really needed to stop calling her so much. Mindy then said goodbye, hung up, and slipped her phone back into her pocket. She hoped Rodney would finally take the hint this time and actually leave her alone. Mindy picked up her notes again, but she couldn't focus. The phone call had totally thrown her off. She thought about calling her ex-boyfriend to let him know what was going on, but things hadn't ended well between them, and she didn't feel like stirring up any bad feelings. So she stood up, stretched, and headed outside to take a walk. Even though multiple sclerosis had kept Mindy from pursuing her basketball career, she still stayed very active. And as much as she loved being around other people, she was almost never happier than when she was outside by herself going for a walk, feeling the sun beat down on her with the wind at her back. And that day, going for a walk outside did the trick. By the time she got back to her apartment, she'd put the stress of the phone call with Rodney behind her. Once she was back inside her apartment, Mindy carried the laundry baskets to her room, and she put her clean clothes away. Then she took a shower, got dressed, and went out to meet her two best friends for dinner. Later that night, when she got back from dinner, Mindy parked her car, stepped outside, and headed up the steps to her apartment. After her walk earlier that day, and now after hanging out with her best friends for the night, Mindy was in a great mood and smiling ear to ear. But then, something strange happened when Mindy got to her door. She felt the hair on her neck stand up. It felt like someone was watching her. She turned around, but she just saw the cars in the parking lot and the outline of the trees in the moonlight across the street. But Mindy still felt uneasy. So she got inside her apartment as fast as she could, and she closed and locked the door. She sat down on the couch and tried to calm herself down. Mindy's friends often made fun of her and said she was afraid of her own shadow, so Mindy told herself her friends must be right, that she was just making things up in her head and getting scared for no reason, and that everything was actually just fine. At around 12:45 p.m. on September 13th, 2006, so over a week after the phone call from Rodney, Mindy walked down the steps outside her apartment, carrying an empty laundry basket in her hands like she'd done a week earlier. Mindy didn't understand how it was already time for her to do laundry again, but she and her two best friends had plans to go out that night, and she hadn't found anything clean that she wanted to wear. So Mindy made her way to the laundry room, took her clean clothes out of the dryer, and piled them high inside of her basket. She was excited to go out that night. She and her friends were always busy with school, with work, or with guys they were dating, but they always made time for each other. And for Mindy, who had grown up in a small town and been really close with her family, having good friends like that made all the difference in the world. Mindy had been nervous when she first moved away from home to go to school, but now she couldn't imagine living somewhere without her two best friends right nearby. Mindy carried the basket out of the laundry room, walked up the steps to her apartment, got her key out of her pocket, and unlocked the door. This time it was a bit easier because she only had the one laundry basket in her arms. Once inside the apartment, Mindy put the laundry basket down and pushed it up against the wall in the entryway, but when she turned around to close her door, she saw someone standing there. Mindy smiled politely and was about to reach out and still just close the door on this person, but before she could, this person just stepped right inside of her apartment and slammed the door behind them. Over an hour later, so at about 2 p.m. that day, Mindy's neighbor, Mo Gibbs, the guy who had helped her get inside of her apartment the week earlier, he stepped out of his apartment carrying a large moving box in his arms. He was going to load up his car downstairs because he, his fiancée, and her younger daughter were in the process of moving to another apartment complex. But when Mo walked past Mindy's apartment, he stopped. The scent of a cleaning product or disinfectant hit him really hard, like somebody had poured out a bunch of Pine Sol nearby. But regardless, Mo just walked past her door and made his way downstairs to the parking lot. And for the rest of the day, other residents of this complex noticed that same really intense chemical smell coming out of Mindy's apartment, but nobody thought it was anything to worry about. Then, at about 9 p.m., so roughly 7 hours after Mo had passed by the door and first noticed that smell, Mindy's two best friends pulled into the parking lot of Mindy's apartment complex. They had been trying to get a hold of Mindy for a while because they had thought she was going to meet them at a bar that night. But when Mindy never showed, and when she didn't answer her phone, they started to get worried because Mindy always answered her phone. One of Mindy's friends opened the passenger side door, stepped outside, walked through the parking lot, and went up the steps towards Mindy's apartment. But she stopped cold about halfway up because she was hit with that really intense smell that smelled like Pine Sol. Mindy's friend figured the apartment management must be cleaning the floors or something, so she just kind of shook off the smell and continued walking up to Mindy's door. When she got there, she knocked, but Mindy didn't answer. So the friend banged harder on the door, but still, no one came to the door. Then she grabbed the doorknob and she felt it turn in her hand. The door was unlocked. And that seemed really weird because, as a young woman living alone, Mindy was hyper-vigilant and always made sure to lock her door. And so with a lot of apprehension, Mindy's friend opened the door and stepped inside, but immediately they stopped because there was something on the ground that made them scream. The friend fumbled for their phone, pulled it out, dialed 911, and then they turned around to run back outside, go downstairs, and tell their friend in the car what they had just seen, but the friend was blocked by a man standing in Mindy's doorway, and suddenly Mindy's friend was screaming even louder. Minutes after Mindy's friend had called 911, Sergeant Dave Swenson of the Valley City Police Department was sitting on his couch watching TV when his phone rang. Swenson glanced down and saw it was the police dispatch. He turned off the TV and answered the phone. On the other line, the dispatcher said they'd just gotten a call from a young woman who was screaming and very upset about something that had happened to her friend. She was so upset that the dispatcher wasn't exactly sure what had even taken place, but the young woman had said something about a strangling. The dispatcher gave Swenson the address of the incident, and he checked and saw it was an apartment complex only about a block from Swenson's house. So he said he'd be over there in a minute and hung up the phone. Swenson was young and was an active part of the small Valley City community. So as he made the short drive down the street, he worried about the young woman who had made the 911 call. It was pretty rare in Valley City for the police to get distraught calls like that. Swenson pulled his car into the apartment parking lot, and he saw two women in their early 20s running towards him and a man pacing back and forth a few feet behind them. Swenson parked his car and stepped outside. The lot was pretty dark, but he could still tell that both women coming towards him had obviously been crying. When the women reached him, Swenson introduced himself, and then one of the women told him something terrible had happened up in her friend's apartment. Swenson told the women to wait right there, and then he rushed past them and the man who was pacing back and forth, and he went up the steps to Mindy's apartment. He walked inside, and immediately he was hit with that smell of pine sol. Then Swenson looked down at the floor, and he saw Mindy's body, and for a second, he almost wanted to cry. Swenson knew Mindy. He had spent time on the college campus where she went to school, and he was a big supporter of the college and high school sports teams in the area, and he had often met Mindy at games. Swenson thought Mindy was one of the kindest, brightest young people he knew, and he couldn't believe what he was now looking at. Mindy was lying on her side just a few feet from the apartment's entryway. Blood covered her shirt, there was a cloth belt wrapped around her throat, and there was a knife with the handle broken off sticking out of her neck. Swenson also saw an empty pine sol bottle laying right next to her. Swenson grabbed his phone out of his pocket and called the station. He knew the small Valley City Police Department was going to need help with a violent crime like this. About 15 minutes later, Special Agents Mark Saylor and Calvin Dupree from the Bureau of Criminal Investigation pulled into the parking lot outside of Mindy's apartment. The Bureau of Criminal Investigation is a state law enforcement agency in North Dakota that aids local police departments with certain cases. Saylor and Dupree stepped out of the car and saw the flashing lights from local police cruisers that had already arrived at the scene. And they saw an officer standing with two young women and a man in the parking lot. Saylor and Dupree waved to that officer and then walked over to the group. Both of the agents were tall with broad shoulders, and they both looked very intimidating. Saylor told Mindy's two friends and the man that was with them that he and Dupree would need to ask them some questions, but it might still be a little while, so he thanked them in advance for their patience. Saylor's voice was soft and calm, a contrast to his physical appearance. Saylor and Dupree left the group and walked across the parking lot and up the steps to Mindy's apartment. They put on their gloves and went inside with the few other local officers that were already in there. Like everyone else who had been near Mindy's apartment that day, the first thing Saylor and Dupree noticed beyond Mindy's body was the strong smell of pine sol. The agents approached Mindy's body and crouched down to get a closer look. It was immediately evident to them that whoever had done this had poured pine sol all over Mindy's body and then tossed the empty bottle to the ground. They figured that the killer must have done that to try to get rid of any physical evidence they might have left behind on Mindy's body. After spending a few minutes examining the victim, Saylor and Dupree did a sweep of the small apartment. In Mindy's bedroom, they saw photos of her and her parents, and of her goofing around with her friends. There were sports trophies and ribbons, and suddenly it just hit both of the agents how young Mindy was and how happy she looked in every picture they had taken of her. It didn't take long for Saylor and Dupree to notice that really nothing in any of the rooms seemed out of place, and there was no sign of forced entry, so this did not look like a robbery to them. Not long after the agents had walked through the apartment, state forensics officers arrived. They got right to work examining blood spatter on the floor and on Mindy's body. Then Saylor and Dupree watched as one of the forensics officers examined Mindy's hands and fingers. And at some point, that officer turned and said he'd found something. Parts of Mindy's fingernails had broken, and she had scratches on her hands. The officer said that indicated that Mindy had put up a fight against her attacker. The forensics officer examined Mindy's fingernails even closer, and he was convinced there would be DNA material from the killer under Mindy's nails. So the officer ordered that Mindy's hands be treated as vital evidence from that moment moving forward. And so another forensics officer approached Mindy's body with two evidence bags, and Saylor and Dupree watched as the forensics officers worked together to painstakingly slide these evidence bags over each of Mindy's hands, and then once they were over, they tied the bags off to keep Mindy's hands from being corrupted until an autopsy could be performed. While the forensics team continued working in the apartment, Saylor and Dupree headed back outside to the parking lot. Once there, they approached Mindy's two friends and that man, who were all still standing with a local officer. Mindy's friend, who had actually discovered the body, told the agents that she and her other friend had wanted to meet Mindy at a bar that night, but Mindy never showed up, so they came here to check on her. Then Agent Saylor asked the man who was there if he was a friend too, but the man shook his head. He said his name was Robert Linz, and he was one of Mindy's neighbors. He said he'd heard screaming outside of his apartment, so he'd run out to see what was going on. Then Robert said he saw Mindy's friend in the apartment, and he walked in to make sure she was okay, and that's when he saw Mindy lying on the ground. Saylor and Dupree thanked Mindy's two friends as well as the neighbor, Robert, and the agent said they would probably need to follow up with all of them soon. Then Saylor and Dupree walked through the parking lot to go back to Mindy's apartment. But as they walked, they talked about Mindy's neighbor, Robert. The guy was wiry and covered in tattoos, which was really not a typical look for people who lived in Valley City. But Saylor and Dupree didn't really care about Robert's tattoos. What they cared about was they had noticed multiple cuts on one of Robert's hands. In the early morning of September 14th, so several hours after Mindy's body had been discovered, Special Agents Saylor and Dupree stepped outside of Mindy's apartment after a long night of combing the place for evidence. The sun was starting to rise and the morning was quiet, but Saylor and Dupree knew that would change as soon as the news about Mindy's murder began to spread through this small town. The agents had worked enough cases in tight-knit communities to know that panic and fear can easily rip through a place like a virus whenever a horrible crime has been committed. As the state crime lab ran tests on blood and DNA evidence found at the scene, Saylor and Dupree wanted to get a jump on the investigation, and they wanted to start with Mindy's tattooed neighbor, Robert. Saylor and Dupree had enough experience to know that some killers would come right back to the scene of the crime when their victim had been discovered. Killers often did this to monitor police activity or to try to alter evidence before police arrived. The agents did not think Mindy's two girlfriends had anything to do with her murder, but Robert seemed like a legitimate suspect. Forensics officers had said they believed Mindy put up a fight, and Robert had those fresh cuts all over his hand. So, Saylor and Dupree began by running a quick background check on Robert. The check revealed that Robert had moved to North Dakota from California, and when he was still in California, he had served over 2 years in prison for stealing a car at gunpoint. Later that morning, Saylor and Dupree interviewed Robert in a small interrogation room at the local police station. Robert was very jittery, like he couldn't sit still during this interview, but he was polite and respectful when he answered the agents' questions. Robert told them again that he had just heard a woman screaming outside of his apartment, so he had gone out to see what was wrong. Then he said he actually stood in the doorway of Mindy's apartment, which initially scared the friend. Then he had actually gone in and checked for Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand, but he couldn't find one, and so that was when he knew she was dead. Saylor and Dupree looked at each other almost like they weren't sure what they had just heard. Dupree asked Robert why he would check Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand and not the tips of his fingers. And without hesitating, Robert said he did that because he did not want to leave his fingerprints on the body. The agents just stared at Robert for a second. For him to be more concerned about leaving fingerprints on the body than just simply finding a pulse in this critical time-sensitive moment, it just seemed off. It frankly seemed like the actions of a criminal or of a killer. But Saylor and Dupree knew this guy had done time in prison, so there was a chance he understood if fingerprints were found on a dead body, he would automatically become a primary suspect, and the cops might not give him the benefit of the doubt. So, Saylor and Dupree were not going to proclaim Robert's guilt right away, no matter how strange and suspicious his actions were. Then, the agents asked Robert how he got the cuts on his hand, and Robert said he had gotten them the day before at the steel manufacturing plant where he worked. He said getting cuts like this was just part of the job. Saylor asked Robert if he would submit samples for a DNA test, and Robert said he would. Shortly after, an officer stepped into the interrogation room and swabbed the inside of Robert's mouth for the DNA sample. Then Dupree and Saylor let Robert go, but they told him not to leave Valley City because they might want to speak to him again. Later that day, officers followed up on Robert's alibi that he had been at work, and multiple people at the steel manufacturing plant said, yep, Robert had been working at the time Mindy had supposedly been murdered. But Saylor and Dupree weren't ready to write off Robert as a suspect quite yet. It was possible his friends could be lying for him, or that they simply had not seen him leave work at some point during the day. Still, Saylor and Dupree did not want to fixate on just one suspect while they were still waiting on test results from DNA samples found under Mindy's fingernails. And because there had been no sign of forced entry into Mindy's apartment, the agents thought there was a good chance Mindy had known her killer. So they focused their investigation on two groups, Mindy's friends and her neighbors. A couple of days into the investigation, and Agent Saylor and Dupree returned to Mindy's apartment complex to interview as many of her neighbors as possible. The agents were accompanied by a local officer, and when they all got to the parking lot, that officer immediately recognized someone. Mindy's neighbor, Mo Gibbs, the man who had helped Mindy hold her laundry while she unlocked her door a couple of weeks earlier, was loading more moving boxes into his car. Mo was a jailer at the county jail, and so he knew most of the officers at the Valley City Police Department. The officer waved hello to Mo and said that they'd love to talk to him to see if maybe he could help them with their investigation. Mo said he'd be happy to help, and he slid a moving box into the backseat of his car and then walked over to that officer and the two agents. Mo was this really tall, huge guy who was built kind of like a tank, and he had a big smile and bright eyes. Agent Saylor said to Mo that because he worked in law enforcement, he might have noticed something on the day of Mindy's murder that the other people in the apartment complex who did not work in law enforcement might have missed. Mo nodded and thought about it for a second, and then he said the one thing he had noticed was the smell of disinfectant on the second floor of the apartment complex on the day Mindy died. But he had just figured somebody was going overboard with their cleaning. Then Saylor asked if Mo could give them any other information about Mindy that could possibly point them in the right direction. Mo said he didn't know Mindy well, but everybody at that complex knew Mindy was like this unbelievably nice person who was kind to everyone. And so Mo said, he couldn't imagine anyone who actually lived in the apartments doing this to her. That maybe it was somebody who did not live in this complex. The special agents and the local officer thanked Mo for his insight, and then they began making their way towards the complex to begin doing interviews with other neighbors. And throughout the day, as Saylor and Dupree talked to more of Mindy's neighbors, they almost all told the same story as Mo. Mindy was nice to everybody, and she always seemed happy, and so they couldn't understand how anyone from this complex, or really anywhere, would have wanted to hurt her. That day, investigators were able to take DNA samples from a number of Mindy's neighbors, but the tests would take time, and investigators couldn't automatically rule anyone out yet. So Saylor and Dupree shifted their focus from the people at the apartment complex to Mindy's friends. And right away, several of Mindy's friends all said the same thing. The police needed to look into Mindy's ex-boyfriend. He and Mindy's breakup had been pretty bad, and most of her friends thought Mindy still had feelings for him, but he didn't feel the same way. So there was a chance that maybe they'd gotten into a fight and things maybe turned violent. The following day, Saylor and Dupree met with Mindy's ex-boyfriend, who went to college in a different city. And they discovered pretty quickly that he had been on his own college campus at the time they believed Mindy had been killed. But Mindy's ex-boyfriend told Saylor and Dupree this story that seemed so bizarre to them that they almost immediately changed the focus of their entire investigation. Mindy's ex-boyfriend said that his own father, Rodney Kuznia, was obsessed with Mindy. And no matter how many times he had asked his dad to stop calling Mindy and to please leave her alone, his dad had refused. Rodney would tell his son that he and everybody else didn't understand the powerful connection he shared with Mindy. Soon after talking to Mindy's ex-boyfriend, Saylor and Dupree were able to search Mindy's cell phone records, and they discovered that Rodney had called Mindy several days in a row leading up to the murder. Then they also saw that he had left Mindy multiple voicemails after she had been killed. And when they listened to those voicemails, they heard Rodney crying and saying he knew what had happened to Mindy and how he couldn't believe he had been robbed of having her in his life. And so based on those voicemails and the conversation they'd had with Mindy's ex-boyfriend, Saylor and Dupree were convinced that Rodney did have a very unhealthy obsession with the 22-year-old Mindy. They also believed Rodney was ultimately interested in having a full-blown romantic relationship with Mindy, or at the very minimum, a sexual relationship with her. And they thought, maybe if Rodney had shown up to Mindy's apartment to try to act on those desires, but Mindy denied him, that Rodney might have snapped and killed her. A few days after Mindy's murder, Agent Saylor and Dupree sat across a small table from Rodney inside of a police station interrogation room. Rodney had white hair and a white mustache that went down to his chin and looked like a horseshoe. He wore jeans, a t-shirt, and a camouflage trucker hat. From the minute Rodney sat down, he had tears in his eyes. Saylor began by asking Rodney to explain his relationship with Mindy. Rodney said he was like a father to her, but then he immediately followed that up by saying he actually loved Mindy because she reminded him so much of his wife when his wife was young. Rodney said his family did not really understand his feelings for Mindy, and they didn't really know how often he talked to her. He said if they did, they would be even angrier with him than they already were. Saylor and Dupree just sat there with stunned looks on their faces. They had seen plenty of older men who were interested in younger women, but there was something about Rodney that just seemed totally different to them. And neither of them could tell if this guy was putting on some elaborate act to cover up what he did, or if he was really paralyzed with grief. Then Rodney looked up at the agents with his red eyes and said, quote, "God picked a beautiful flower," end quote. And then Rodney started crying even more. Saylor and Dupree kept looking over at each other, wondering if maybe one of them should step forward and kind of calm Rodney down and get him to talk again, but neither of them wanted to stop Rodney in fear he might suddenly admit something because of how upset he was. And so Saylor and Dupree just kind of sat there and let Rodney cry. Finally, Rodney would collect himself and he would sit up straight and wipe the tears from his eyes, and then Saylor asked him where he had been on the day of Mindy's murder. And Rodney said he had been working on his farm with one of his sons. Saylor asked Rodney if he would submit a DNA sample for testing, and Rodney said he would. So, after an officer had swabbed Rodney's mouth for samples, Saylor and Dupree decided to let him go, at least until they got the DNA test results back and they had looked into his alibi. Rodney stood up in the interrogation room, he hugged the agents, and walked out. The interview with Rodney proved to be one of the strangest that Saylor and Dupree had ever conducted. But despite being totally unsure if Rodney really was just sad or was involved, he now was the leading suspect, along with Mindy's neighbor, Robert, who had checked Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand. But the investigators wanted the results of both men's DNA tests before they'd be willing to make an arrest. So in the meantime, they continued to dig into their suspects' alibis to see if they could find any flaws and maybe catch a clear break in the case. On September 19th, 2006, so 6 days after Mindy's murder, almost 500 people gathered in a local high school gym for Mindy's memorial service. Mindy's parents had planned to have the service in their church where Mindy had spent so much time when she was younger, but there had been such a large public outpouring for Mindy that her parents knew the church would not be big enough to hold everyone who wanted to pay their respects. In the high school gym, Mindy's friends talked about what a light in the world Mindy had been, how she was that rare kind of person who dedicated herself to spreading joy and making other people's lives better. And Mindy's parents urged people to remember Mindy as the happy, kind, beautiful young woman she had been. It was still less than a week after Mindy's murder, but in the days leading up to the memorial service, pressure had really started to mount on the investigation. Local residents called into the police station wanting to know if it was safe for them to leave their houses and just walk the streets of Valley City. Saylor and Dupree understood their concerns. An unsolved murder in a small town often convinced people that they could be the next victim, but Saylor and Dupree felt like they were getting close to finding Mindy's killer. Mindy's ex-boyfriend's father, Rodney, had been obsessed with her, and obsession was definitely a viable motive. Then there was her neighbor, Robert, who had gone out of his way not to leave fingerprints at the scene. And so Saylor and Dupree were almost certain that when the DNA test results came in, those results would lead them right to Rodney or Robert. On September 20th, the day after Mindy's memorial service, Agent Saylor received a call while he and Dupree were meeting with the investigative team at the Valley City Police Station. Saylor picked up his phone, and someone from the state crime lab told him that they had the results back from several of the DNA tests that were taken during the investigation, and one of those samples matched the DNA samples taken from under Mindy's fingernails. And it turned out those DNA samples belonged to someone who already had a criminal record. Saylor hung up the phone and told Dupree what he just heard. Then the agents thanked the local officers on the investigative team for all their hard work, and Saylor said they now knew who had killed Mindy. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the scene of the crime and on the victim's body, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened on September 13th, 2006, the day someone murdered 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern. At 12:45 p.m. that day, the killer watched Mindy pull her clean clothes out of the dryer inside of her apartment complex's laundry room. The killer thought about going up and speaking to Mindy, but ultimately they decided it would be better if they surprised her. So the killer stepped away from the laundry room and quickly walked across the first floor of the apartment complex. Then they ran up the steps to the second floor, they eyed Mindy's apartment, and then walked around a corner so they could see her apartment without being seen themselves. Then the killer waited for a couple of minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the killer saw Mindy reach the top of the steps and walk towards her apartment door. Then they watched as Mindy reached into her pocket and took out her key. At this point, the killer quickly moved from their hiding spot around the corner and walked toward Mindy's front door. And they were only a few feet away when Mindy stepped inside and pushed the laundry basket up against the wall. The killer stepped right into Mindy's doorway, and when Mindy turned around to close and lock the door, the killer just stood there smiling. Mindy smiled back, but before Mindy could say anything, the killer grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her back into the entryway. Then the killer stepped inside her apartment and slammed the door, trapping both of them inside. The killer moved in on Mindy, but Mindy lunged at the killer. Mindy was fast and strong, and she thrashed at the killer, but the killer was able to get a hold of Mindy and wrap their arms around her and throw her hard to the floor. Mindy lay there for a second stunned, and as she did, the killer glanced around the room and saw a cloth belt near the pile of clothes in the laundry basket. Without thinking, the killer grabbed the belt and then crouched over Mindy, and before Mindy could try to get to her feet, the killer began wrapping the belt around Mindy's throat, and they began tightening their grip. Mindy scratched and clawed at the killer's hands, but they held on tight and kept pulling harder and harder on that belt. Mindy gasped for air over and over again until she couldn't anymore, and then finally the killer loosened their grip, and Mindy collapsed fully on the floor and stopped fighting. But the killer could still hear Mindy wheezing. She was alive. And the killer knew they had already been in the apartment much longer than they had planned. So the killer left Mindy struggling to catch her breath on the floor, with the belt still wrapped around her neck, and they rushed into the kitchen. They began pulling open all the drawers until they found a large, sharp kitchen knife. Then the killer took that knife and marched back to where Mindy was still on the floor. The killer crouched down again, grabbed Mindy by the hair, tilted her head back, put the blade just above where the belt was wrapped around her, and slit Mindy's throat. Afterwards, the killer jabbed the knife deep into Mindy's neck. Blood poured down Mindy's neck and onto her shirt and arms, and then Mindy died. The killer stood up and looked down at Mindy's body. Suddenly, they started to panic. There was so much blood, and Mindy had really fought back. The killer knew they must have left physical evidence on her body, and there were definitely fingerprints on the knife. So the killer darted back into the kitchen and threw open the cabinets under the sink. And there, they found a pair of rubber cleaning gloves and a bottle of Pine Sol. The killer put on the gloves, grabbed the bottle that was almost full, and went back to Mindy's body. The killer put the bottle down on the floor, then they gripped the knife handle sticking out of Mindy's neck in one hand, and then braced the other hand against Mindy's shoulder, and they broke off the knife handle. Then they pocketed the handle and grabbed the bottle of Pine Sol. They opened it up and poured it all over Mindy's face, shirt, arms, and legs. When the bottle was empty, the killer just dropped it on the floor next to Mindy. They stood up and walked to the door. The killer cracked open the door and looked out into the hallway to make sure nobody was close by. Then they stepped out into the hall, shutting the door behind them. They turned, they walked down the hall, they turned the corner, and went into their own apartment. Once inside, the killer got rid of the knife handle in the trash and rinsed off their hands and face in the sink. Not long after that, the killer stepped out of their apartment like nothing had happened, and they began heading down to the parking lot to load their car with moving boxes. It would turn out Mo Gibbs, who was Mindy's neighbor and a county jailer, murdered Mindy Morgenstern. Mo had often seen Mindy around the apartment complex, and at times he had even watched her from the shadows. Then, a little over a week before the murder, Mo had helped her hold her laundry while she was able to unlock her door and get inside of her apartment, and it was during that brief interaction that Mo decided he had to have sex with her. But Mo and his fiancée were moving out of the apartment complex soon, and he felt like he had to move fast. So on May 13th, when he saw Mindy doing laundry again, he decided it was time to act. After the murder, Mo had just gone about his business like normal, loading up his car and texting his fiancée. But when he had smelled the strong scent of pine sol, he worried that he might have gone too far, and that the smell might draw attention to the scene. But hours passed without anybody going into Mindy's apartment, and even when Mindy's friend found her body later that night, Mo didn't panic. He just kept going to work, spending time with his fiancée and his daughter, and getting ready to move like everything was fine. But when the DNA test results came in, they pointed investigators directly to Mo. And so Agents Saylor and Dupree started digging into Mo's history, and they discovered he was not the man he said he was. Years before Mindy's murder, he had changed his name to Mo Gibbs, come to Valley City, and taken up an entirely new identity. This had allowed Mo to hide the fact that he had prior convictions when he applied for his job at the county jail. But Mo's past came out when the DNA under Mindy's fingernails matched the samples he had provided, because it also turned out that Mo's DNA samples matched DNA samples found in an unsolved rape case that had taken place years earlier in Fargo, North Dakota. And so police came to believe that Mo had attacked Mindy in her apartment with the intention of ultimately raping her, but when Mindy had fought back so fiercely, Mo abandoned that plan and just killed her. Police arrested Mo, and following his arrest, 6 women came forward and accused him of sexually assaulting them while they were prisoners in the county jail where he worked. And one of those women actually said Mo had sexually assaulted her just hours before Mindy was murdered. Mo Gibbs was found guilty of Mindy's murder, and he pled guilty to 6 counts of rape stemming from the accusations made by the women who had come forward. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on YouTube. Again, that channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a hot summer day in Illinois, police officers made their way through a big field out in the middle of nowhere. They pushed aside the tall grass, and they could see and hear flies buzzing all around them. And then suddenly, the officer at the front of the group stopped. They crouched down and then signaled to the others. They had finally found the body. The other officers rushed to him, and when they got there, they all just stopped and stared down at the dead young woman. The cops knew something like this was going to leave the people in the small town nearby in complete shock. But they had no idea what this discovery would lead to, because this dead young woman in the field would soon help solve a murder that had taken place across the border in Indiana, and lead police to a cold-blooded killer who had been on the run for 2 years. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please remove the Follow Buttons deodorant stick from its container and replace it with cream cheese. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Saturday, September 6, 1997, 19-year-old Brooke Baker typed furiously on a computer in the journalism department at Vincennes University in the small college town of Vincennes, Indiana. Brooke looked at the words on the screen, and she felt a rush of excitement. Writing was her favorite pastime. She was a journalist and editor for the university newspaper, but this felt different. because Brooke was writing the most important story she'd ever worked on. She finished writing her opening paragraph, read it over a few times, and then exhaled. This was a great start. And she'd secured a major interview in a few days that she knew would make this story the talk of the entire campus when it was done. Brooke loved the idea of having a story that she wrote be talked about by students and faculty. She was only a sophomore, but she already had clear goals for after graduation. She wanted to move to New York and become a writer for the highly prestigious Rolling Stone magazine. But to make that happen, she really needed experience writing major stories like the one she was working on. But in truth, it wasn't the attention or potential accolades that made Brooke want to become a professional journalist. She believed that good reporting and good writing could really make a difference in the world and that it could genuinely help people who needed help. And so that's why she had chosen to write this story in the first place, and why she was now willing to spend part of her weekend alone in the journalism department working on it. Brooke looked down at her watch and saw it was already 3 p.m., later than she realized. So she put her notes in her backpack and got ready to leave. But before she left, she checked her school email. She opened up the first message, and immediately she felt a pit form in her stomach. Then she glanced all around the room, like she thought maybe somebody was secretly watching her, and then she logged out of her email, slung her backpack over her shoulder, and rushed out of the room. Outside, she saw a young man named Steve Hoffman standing by the door with a huge smile on his face. Brooke had long, light brown hair with blue eyes, and today she was wearing jeans and a baggy t-shirt, and Steve thought she was one of the prettiest girls he'd ever met. They'd gone out a couple of times, and Steve hoped they would start going out more often. Brooke smiled back at Steve and apologized for keeping him waiting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that he'd only been there a couple of minutes, but then Steve noticed the worried look on Brooke's face, and he asked if everything was okay. Brooke said, yep, everything's fine. She was just stressed about the story she was working on. And then before Steve could ask any more questions, she took Steve's arm, and they began walking past all the red brick buildings that lined the campus. It was a warm day, almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and a group of students were reclining nearby on the grass, soaking in the sun. The campus was always calm and beautiful around this time of the year, and just walking outside with Steve relaxed Brooke, and so she put the email she had just read out of her mind. A few minutes later, Brooke and Steve turned away from the center of campus onto a small street that had several fast food restaurants on it. Not far away, they could see a bridge that stretched all the way across the Wabash River and led into the state of Illinois on the other side. Brooke and Steve walked into a sandwich place, grabbed some food, and sat down, and before long they were talking about school and also their shared love of movies. And then at some point, as casually as he could, Steve asked if Brooke maybe wanted to come back to his apartment later that night to watch a movie. He said his roommate was going to be out, so they'd have the place to themselves. Brooke told Steve that did sound fun, but she already had plans. So maybe they could hang out and watch movies next weekend. Steve said that would be great, and then they talked some more and finished up their lunch, and then before long, they left the shop and began heading back to campus. And after walking for a little bit, it was time to part ways, and so Brooke thanked Steve again for lunch, and then she walked past the journalism department building and crossed the street to her house. Brooke had chosen this small white wooden house to live in during her sophomore year because it was so close to the university building where she spent most of her time, the journalism building. She also chose it because she could afford to live there by herself. Brooke loved spending time with people, but she also loved having a quiet place to write without any distractions. But tonight was not going to be one of those nights where she wanted total silence and peace because she wasn't writing. Instead, she was going to a party. And so Brooke went inside her house, she dropped her backpack on the floor, and then headed to her bedroom, where she began digging through her closet and laying out clothes to figure out which outfit she was going to wear for the fun that night. After midnight on September 7th, so about 9 hours after Brooke met Steve for lunch, Brooke danced to the music blaring through a small house located just off campus. The party she was at had been raging for a while, and Brooke was having a great time. She'd been really stressed about the story, and this was a good chance for her to blow off some steam. Brooke grinned at the tall young man dancing next to her, and then she wrapped her arms around his neck. His name was Tommy Williams, and he looked at Brooke just the same way that Steve did. He thought she was totally beautiful. And then Tommy asked if she wanted to get out of there with him. Brooke nodded and said, yeah, let's go back to my place. And so the two of them said their goodbyes to some friends, and then they left together. The two walked for a few minutes through town and then eventually cut across the campus, which was empty except for a couple of other students wandering home after a night out. Brooke and Tommy had just passed the journalism department and had begun to cross the street to Brooke's house when suddenly bright headlights lit up their faces and they stopped walking. Brooke turned and saw a campus police officer sitting in his vehicle on the street. Brooke grabbed Tommy's hand and told him to walk fast. And so the two crossed the street the rest of the way, and they approached Brooke's house. But before going in, Tommy asked Brooke, like, hey, what's going on? It's just a campus cop. He's most likely just out here looking for drunk students. Like, we're okay. We're not going to get in trouble. But Brooke would say that the guy in the vehicle was not just a campus cop. He was also her landlord, and he totally creeped her out. She told Tommy that she'd caught her landlord a few times watching her through her window. And not long ago, she had gotten out of the shower one time and walked out of the bathroom wearing nothing but a towel, and he was just standing there in her apartment. She had screamed at him and asked, what are you doing here? And he said he'd just come to spray the house for bugs. He said it was his right to come in whenever he needed because he was the landlord. Tommy couldn't believe it and said that was totally insane. And he told Brooke that she really should go tell the police, like the actual city police, not the campus cops, because this guy sounded legitimately dangerous. Brooke nodded, but said she really just didn't want to talk about it, at least not right then. And so she grabbed her keys out of her purse, but before she could unlock her door, behind them, both she and Tommy heard the sound of another car coming down the road and slowing down basically right behind them, out on the road. But when Brooke and Tommy turned around, the car sped off. Tommy didn't get a good look at the car, and so he just asked Brooke, like, hey, who was that? Who would be pulling up in front of your house and then speeding off in the middle of the night? Brooke just shook her head. She didn't say anything, but she actually did recognize this second car. It was Steve's. Brooke secretly wondered if maybe Steve had just been waiting by her house on the off chance she might want to go hang out. Or if maybe he had been following her since they ate lunch together that afternoon. And so between the email she got before she left the journalism department, the campus cop parked in front of her house, and now Steve driving and lurking around her house, it had been a really weird day. But still, Brooke was having a good time with Tommy, and she didn't want any of that other stuff to ruin her night. So she opened the door and led Tommy inside. At 9 p.m. that night, so basically 20-ish hours after Brooke and Tommy went inside of Brooke's house, Brooke's brother knocked on Brooke's front door and called out to his sister. The siblings were supposed to have gotten together that afternoon, but Brooke hadn't been home when he came by. Back in 1997, cell phones were not nearly as prominent as they are now, and Brooke and her brother didn't have them. And so Brooke's brother had tried calling her home, her landline phone, a few times throughout the day, but she hadn't answered. And so now he had just come by her house to make sure she was okay. And so the brother knocked on the door one more time and waited a few minutes, but when he didn't hear anything inside and, the door didn't open, finally he just reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and used the house key that Brooke had given him for her place, and he unlocked the front door. Once he stepped inside, he immediately heard the sound of water running in the bathroom. He figured Brooke must be taking a bath or a shower, so he shouted out to let her know that he was there. But again, nobody responded. Brooke's brother walked down a short hallway towards the bathroom, continuing to call out for his sister, but when he got down the hall, he saw the bathroom door was wide open, and so was the shower curtain, and Brooke wasn't in there. He walked into the bathroom and went straight to the bath, and when he did, he was just confused. The water was running in the bath, and several wet towels were laying in the middle of the tub. He turned off the water and then walked out of the bathroom and headed down the hall towards Brooke's bedroom. He knocked but got no response, and so eventually he opened up the door and walked inside, and right away he turned his head, because the lights were on in the bedroom, and his sister was totally naked, asleep in her bed, and part of her body was exposed. And so Brooke's brother immediately said, I'm so sorry, and he shielded his eyes. And as he was standing there, he didn't hear his sister kind of reacting to his presence, and he knew his sister was actually a really heavy sleeper, and so without looking, he sort of walked over with his head turned away and was starting to cover his sister up with a blanket, to keep her warm. But as he did, he stopped, because something just didn't seem right. He's not looking at his sister, but he can hear her, or more specifically, he can't hear her. He can't hear her breathing. And so finally, the brother just turned and looked directly at his sister and also the wall above the headboard, and he just started shaking uncontrollably. And then a moment later, he turned, ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Detective Greg Winkler of the Indiana State Police pulled up to Brooke's white wooden house and parked several feet away from the ambulance that was already out front. The town of Vincennes had a really small police department, and so anytime there was a violent crime in the town, the state police were called. But that really didn't happen very often, and when it did happen, these violent crimes almost never occurred near the college campus. And so Winkler had been very surprised when he got this call. He stepped out of his car and looked up and down the street. It was basically empty, and so Winkler was clearly the first cop to have arrived at the scene. So Winkler walked over and introduced himself, and even though it was pretty dark out in front of the house, Winkler could tell the young man had been sobbing. Winkler eventually asked Brooks' brother if he could please explain what had happened. Brooks' brother told the detective that he and his sister were going to meet up that day, but he hadn't been able to get in touch with her, and so that's why he came by her house. Then he told Winkler about how he let himself in with his own key, and then also what he had seen in the bathroom and, of course, in the bedroom. Detective Winkler thanked him and asked him to please keep waiting outside. Then Winkler walked into the house and found paramedics standing by Brooks' bedroom door. They informed him that the young woman had been dead when they arrived. Winkler nodded and walked into the bedroom. He saw Brooks' body laying on the bed, and right away he lowered his head. He was an experienced homicide detective, but that did not make a scene like this any easier to deal with. Winkler could see immediately that there was blood spatter on the wall behind the bed. He got closer to the body, and he saw multiple wounds on Brooks' neck and chest. There was also blood on the sheets, as if she had suffered wounds on her back as well. Then Winkler noticed the bruising on her inner thighs. The detective would have to wait for the forensics team to arrive, but so far, to him, based on what he was seeing, this looked like a violent murder that had followed a sexual assault. Winkler felt angry. The victim was basically still a kid. I mean, one look at the pictures and decorations in her room made that obvious. He walked into the hall, ready to search the rest of the house, but he saw that several local police and state forensics officers had just arrived. One of the Vincennes PD officers was Detective Bob Dunham. The two men greeted each other. They had worked together before. And Winkler turned around and led Dunham into Brooks' room. Dunham looked at the body and the bloodstains on the wall. He had the same thought and felt the same anger as Winkler. Someone most likely had raped this young woman and then viciously killed her. A few minutes later, the detectives left the bedroom and began to search the rest of the house. They started with the bathroom, where those wet towels were laying in the bath, and then after that, they went to the kitchen and they found the sink filled with water with several knives soaking in it. Durham called out to one of the nearby forensics officers, who then quickly came into the kitchen, and they all agreed at least one of those knives in the sink could be a murder weapon, so the forensics officer bagged up all the knives as evidence. After that, the detectives continued their search of the house, and they didn't find any sign of forced entry, and also they found Brooks' purse and some cash just laying out in the open. So from the looks of it, this didn't seem like a crime connected to a robbery. And not long after the detectives had done this search of the house, the forensics team that was also at the house determined that very likely Brooke had been sexually assaulted before being killed, just like the detectives had thought. The forensics officers also pulled DNA samples from Brooke's body, from under her fingernails, and also from the blood on the wall, and they informed the detectives that they would have further information about what happened to her after processing a rape kit. And so to this point, the detectives felt like they sort of had a good amount of information about what very likely happened here, a rape followed by a murder. A horrible thing, but relatively straightforward. And so the detectives believed they were looking for a man, maybe a current or ex-boyfriend who Brooke knew well enough to let into the house, because again, there was no sign of forced entry. Or if it was not a current or ex-boyfriend, they believed they were still looking for a man, but one who just happened to have his own key to this house. Winkler stepped outside and found Brooks' brother standing with a couple of officers. Winkler walked over to him and asked him to give him a more detailed timeline of exactly where he had been that day and also the night before. And Brooks' brother laid it out for him. When he wasn't trying to track down his sister, he had mostly been hanging out with friends. Now, the police would obviously have to follow up with his friends to confirm his alibi, but for now, they took him at face value, and then Winkler asked the brother if he knew of anybody else, friends, family, anybody, who might have a key to his sister's house. Brooks' brother thought about it and then said he was pretty sure he was the only family member who had a key, and then he also said that he did know Brooks' landlord also had a key. He told Winkler the landlord was a campus cop named Mike Nardine, and he knew that his sister could not stand him. Winkler asked why. Was he just like a bad landlord or something? But Brooks' brother said it was way worse than that. He said Mike used to watch his sister through the windows, and one time he had even let himself into the apartment unannounced. At this point, Brooks' brother looked right at Winkler, and the detective looked back and could see how angry the brother was. And so Winkler, sensing there was more here, asked the brother, is there anything else police needed to know about this landlord guy? And Brooks' brother just nodded. He said he was almost positive her landlord, Mike, had offered to let Brooke keep her rent money in exchange for sex. A couple of days later, Detective Winkler and Dunham met with Mike Nardine, the landlord. Brooke's autopsy report suggested that she had been murdered late at night on September 6th or in the early morning hours of September 7th, and the detectives had learned that Mike, the landlord, was working on campus around that exact time and not far from Brooke's house. Mike walked into the small interview room at the Vincennes Police Department and sat down across from the two detectives. And right away, the detectives could tell Mike was angry. He made it very clear that he did not understand why they would drag a fellow officer in for this kind of interrogation. But Winkler and Dunham assured Mike they were just trying to get a clear picture of what had happened. This didn't seem to make Mike any happier, but he did answer the detectives' questions about his relationship with Brooke. He told them that he was her landlord and that they would talk from time to time when he was doing work on her house or collecting the rent. When there was a pause in the conversation, Winkler just asked Mike straight out if he had ever spied on Brooke when she was in her house, or if he had ever told Brooke she could exchange sex for rent. Mike glared at the two detectives. He said none of that happened, and if he ever showed up at the house unannounced, it was just to do work that had to get done. That was it. At this, Dunham spoke up, and he told Mike, okay, that all makes sense, and then Dunham asked if Mike would submit to a polygraph test and also provide a DNA sample. After all, if Mike was telling the truth, DNA and a polygraph were the easiest ways to prove that. Mike continued to just glare at the two detectives, but he agreed to both requests. And so Dunham and Winkler excused themselves and walked out of the room, and they quickly arranged for the polygraph test and also sent an officer into the room to swab Mike's cheek for the DNA sample. And a little while later that day, after Mike had taken the polygraph, the detectives thanked him for coming in and told him they would follow up if they needed to. Mike just shook his head and walked out of the room. Once he was gone, Winkler and Dunham joined the polygraph examiner, and the examiner reviewed Mike's test right in front of them, and he told the detectives that the results were inconclusive, which meant there was definitely a chance that Mike had lied on several questions, namely about his relationship with Brooke. Investigators knew it was going to take some time to get the test results back for Mike's DNA sample, as well as the DNA samples that were taken from the crime scene. So while they waited, they spent the next several days interviewing Brooke's friends and family to try to get as much information about the college sophomore as possible. And during these interviews, several people vouched for Brooke's brother's whereabouts on the night and early morning when his sister's murder had supposedly taken place. And so Winkler and Dunham did not consider him to be a primary suspect. But just about all of Brooke's friends told the detectives that there were two guys that Brooke had been seeing, Steve Hoffman and Tommy Williams, and she had hung out with both of them on the day before she was found dead. Winkler and Dunham brought Steve into the station first, and after he sat down, Steve kept fumbling with his hands and running his hands through his hair. It was obvious the kid was nervous. But the detectives didn't think that was very suspicious because after all, he was young and he had just been thrown right into the middle of a murder investigation. Winkler spoke calmly to Steve. He said Steve was not in any trouble, but they needed him to be completely honest with them, even if whatever he had to say might be embarrassing or might make him feel like he was betraying Brooke's trust. Steve nodded and said he would tell them whatever they needed to know. So Winkler started by asking how long Steve and Brooke had been together. But right away, Steve said he and Brooke weren't really dating, they were just friends with benefits. They had started hanging out with each other recently, and they had had sex a few times, but Steve said he really liked Brooke, and he really hoped that their relationship would become more serious over time. Then Dunham asked point blank if Steve had slept with Brooke that past weekend, but Steve said no, he hadn't. He said he met Brooke for lunch on Saturday and asked if she wanted to meet up later that night at his place, but she said she already had plans. After a pause, Dunham leaned in and asked Steve if his lunch date with Brooke was actually the last time he had seen Brooke. And at this question, Steve sort of froze and began to stammer like he couldn't make a sentence, but then he finally said, after their lunch, he had just gone back to his apartment and his roommate, Brian Jones, could vouch for him. Dunham nodded and asked if he and his roommate Brian were both at the apartment the whole day. But Steve said that Brian had gone out later that night, so Steve at one point was at the apartment just by himself. And at this point, Dunham just said, okay, take a deep breath, and I want you to answer the original question. Was lunch the last time you saw Brooke? At this, Steve shook his head, and his face turned bright red like he was totally embarrassed. And he told the detectives that on the night after he and Brooke had gotten lunch together, he had driven to her house and actually parked his car nearby. He knew she had gone out that night, but he thought maybe when she got home, she might want to hang out with him. But around maybe 1 a.m. or so, he saw Brooke walk up to her door with another guy. And when he saw this, he felt this immediate rush of jealousy and anger, and for a second he drove right up in front of her house and then sped off down the street. Dunham and Winkler looked at each other as if they kind of knew that this was a big moment in the interview. And then Winkler turned back towards Steve and leaned in, and he asked if Steve had been angry enough about seeing this other guy to maybe go back to Brooke's house later to confront Brooke about the other guy. Maybe they got into a fight. Maybe things got out of control. At this point, Steve began to get visibly upset. He said he never went back to the house, he really liked Brooke, and he would never hurt her. He had just been stupid and jealous, and that was really it. The detectives let Steve collect himself, and then after a few moments, Dunham asked him if he would provide a DNA sample. And at this, Steve did not hesitate. He said he would do whatever they needed if it would help them find Brooke's killer. Later that week, Winkler and Dunham met with Tommy, the other guy that Brooke was seeing before she was killed, and the interview went pretty much the same way the interview with Steve had gone. Tommy said he and Brooke periodically went out together, and yes, they had slept with each other a few times, but they were not in a serious relationship. Tommy said he and Brooke had been at a party together that Saturday night, then they had gone to her house, and they had had sex. He said he left not long afterwards, maybe sometime around 1:30 in the morning, and then he walked around campus for a while, and eventually ended up going to his friend's apartment and crashing on his couch. Now, this part of Tommy's story did jump out at the detectives. Tommy could be telling the truth here, but there was a gap of time when nobody would have seen him, so he had no alibi. And that was more than enough time for him to murder Brooke, dump those towels in the bath, put the murder weapon in the sink, clean himself up, and then head to his friend's place. And so the detectives asked Tommy to submit a DNA sample, and he said he would. And then after Tommy had given that sample, the detectives told him that he could go, but that he needed to stay in town. A few weeks into the investigation, the DNA test results from the crime scene and also the results from the rape kit came in, and both provided a DNA sample that the crime lab believed belonged to Brooke's killer. But soon after that, DNA test results came in for Brooke's landlord Mike and from the two guys Brooke had been seeing, Steve and Tommy, but none of their DNA was a clear match to the samples taken from Brooke's body and the crime scene. Now, this did not necessarily mean that, now Mike, Steve, and Tommy are all innocent, but it did mean that police did not have the kind of scientific evidence that would hold up in court. So investigators didn't feel like they had enough to arrest any of their top 3 suspects. And these test results felt like a major setback for Winkler and Dunham. They had become convinced that one of the DNA samples they had secured would match the killer's. And so now they had to totally refocus their investigation and start looking for potential leads that maybe they had overlooked. And as is often the case when a terrible crime takes place in a small community, police began getting lots of pressure from local media, city leaders, and Brooke's friends and family to solve this case quickly. At around this time, Winkler and Dunham made their way across the university campus towards the journalism department. It was hard for them to describe, but even the campus felt like it was full of tension from this case. Like nobody could relax because they feared they might be the next victim because whoever did this had not been caught yet. The detectives entered the journalism department, walked down a long hallway lit with bright fluorescent lights, and found their way to a small office that was cluttered with books. In the office was one of Brooke's journalism professors, who also served as Brooke's advisor, and she welcomed Winkler and Dunham, and then she sat down at her desk. The detectives thanked her for meeting with them, and then Winkler got right into it. He asked her if she knew of any rivalries between Brooke and maybe other journalism students. He told the professor that at this point, the police were looking for anything that might point them in the right direction. Brooke's professor said nothing like that was going on, at least nothing that she was aware of. She said Brooke was very friendly and outgoing and was able to get along with pretty much everyone. She was even one of those rare students who didn't fall into a specific clique and who had friends from all different groups on campus. But then the professor stopped and lowered her voice, and with a very serious look, she told the detectives that actually there might be one group of students that the police should look into. The professor said right before Brooke was killed, she had been working on a story that was going to make a lot of people angry. She was covering an alleged rape that had taken place during a frat party right out on the steps in the front of the frat house. Brooke was set to interview the young woman who was accusing the fraternity brothers, but Brooke had died just days before that interview was going to happen. At this, Winkler and Dunham shot each other a look. This was not anything that Brooke's friends had mentioned. So the detectives got as much information about the story and the fraternity as they could. Then they thanked the professor again, left the campus, and then arranged to search Brooke's phone records and emails. And as they were conducting the search, they quickly discovered Brooke had been receiving threatening emails from members of this fraternity the entire time she'd been working on the story. And one of those emails simply read, "Write the story and you will die." This new lead initially gave a huge jolt to the investigation. Over the next few weeks, police tracked down the members of the fraternity who were directly connected to the story Brooke had been writing, and they secured DNA samples from 10 of these young men, and they interviewed a number of students who had actually been at the frat party in question. However, when the DNA test results came back from the frat brothers, none of them matched the killer's DNA sample. This left Detectives Winkler and Dunham almost at a complete loss. Lead after lead had fallen apart, and it was starting to look like maybe Brooke's killer just had no clear connection to her at all. Over the next several months, the detectives continued to search for new evidence and new leads, but nothing of use surfaced. And eventually, the Vincennes Police Department determined that they didn't have the resources to continue their full-time investigation. So Detective Dunham was pulled away to work on other cases. And then finally, after a year had gone by and still there was no more traction on the case, the Indiana State Police determined that Brooke's murder was now officially a cold case. On July 5th, 1999, almost 2 years after Brooke's murder, Detective Winkler sat at his desk looking over cases that had come in during the July 4th holiday. The phone rang and Winkler answered. Detective Dunham was on the other line, and he was talking so fast, Winkler almost couldn't understand him. But Dunham eventually slowed down and said he was at an apartment in town following up on a missing persons call, and Winkler needed to get there right now. And so Winkler, who trusted Dunham, he hung up, got in his car, and sped across town. Winkler found Dunham waiting for him outside the apartment complex, and then as soon as Winkler got out, Dunham quickly led him into the apartment and right to the bathroom. And Winkler almost could not believe what he was seeing. A pile of wet towels were right there in the middle of the tub, and Dunham told Winkler the bathwater had been running when police arrived at the scene. Then Dunham led Winkler to the kitchen, and the sink was filled with water, and knives were soaking in it. Next, they went to the bedroom, and Dunham showed Winkler the bloodstains on the wall. The crime scene looked almost identical to the scene at Brooke's house, except for one major difference. The Vincennes University sophomore who lived there, Erica Norman, was nowhere to be found. Investigators thought there was still a chance Erica was alive, and so they quickly coordinated with local and state police right across the Wabash River in Illinois, and they launched a 2-state search for her. But 15 days later, on July 20th, 1999, police would find Erica, but she was deceased. Her body was found abandoned in a field on the Illinois side of the river. Back in Indiana, Winkler and Dunham met with several of Erica's friends. And one of them told the detectives that the night Erica had gone missing, she had gone home to watch movies with a guy she knew from work. And when Erica's friend told them who this guy was, the detectives felt a rush of adrenaline, but they also felt a huge sense of regret. They recognized the name, and so now they were nearly certain who had killed both Erica Norman and Brooke Baker. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted over a 2-year period, the following is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened to Brooke Baker in the early morning hours of September 7th, 1997. The killer sat on the couch next to Brooke. The pair was watching TV, but at some point, Brooke said she was tired and just wanted to go to bed. However, as Brooke began to get up to leave, the killer turned and grabbed her by the arm and pulled her in to kiss her. Brooke shied away and said she didn't want to do that, but the killer just jumped on top of her and then tried to take her clothes off. Immediately, Brooke tried to fight him off, and she slashed the killer's face with her fingernails, and the killer was so stunned by it, he kind of sat up for a second, at which point Brooke managed to jump up from underneath him off the couch, and she ran down the hall. But the killer just ran right after her. He caught up to her, grabbed her from behind, and shoved her into the nearest bedroom. He forced Brooke onto the bed, ripped off her clothes, and then sexually assaulted her. The whole time, Brooke tried to fight back, but she couldn't break free. And then at some point, the killer, who was on top of her, grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. Brooke coughed and wheezed and tried to get air, but the killer kept choking her tighter and tighter until Brooke began to lose consciousness. But the killer let go and climbed off the bed. Brooke was still breathing, but she could barely move. And so the killer ran out of the room, went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife in the sink, and then ran back to the bedroom. Brooke saw her killer rushing back into the room with the knife, and so she used the little strength she had left to turn over on her side and try to pull herself up and out of the bed, but the killer just leapt on top of her again, and he slammed the knife over and over and over again into Brooke's back, stabbing her a total of 11 times. As the killer did this, blood sprayed on the wall, the sheets, and the killer's hands and clothes, and when the killer was done, they climbed off of Brooke and rolled her onto her back. They weren't sure, but they thought Brooke was still breathing. So they raised the knife and stabbed her in the chest. Now, the killer was sure she was dead. The killer climbed off the bed and stood in the bedroom, breathing heavily and trying to collect their thoughts. Finally, they walked out and went to the bathroom. They put the knife down, grabbed a few towels, and tried to wipe the blood off themselves. Then they threw the towels into the tub and turned on the water. Then they picked up the murder weapon, the knife, and went to the kitchen. They filled the sink up with water and then dropped the knife in it to soak. Then the killer walked through the apartment, turned off the TV, then walked to the front door. They opened it up and locked the handle from the inside, and then poked their head out, kind of scanning the street. And when everything looked clear, the killer casually stepped outside, closing the now locked door behind them, and then they took off running across campus back to their apartment. It would turn out Brooke had known her killer well enough to let them into her house, just as investigators had suspected. But the killer was not one of the young men Brooke was seeing. It was actually one of their roommates. At the time of Brooke's murder, Brian Jones had lived with Steve, the guy who met Brooke for lunch and hoped to, at some point, have a more serious relationship with her. And so Brian had met Brooke a few times when she had come by the apartment to see Steve, and they had gotten along well, because Brooke got along with basically everybody. But Brooke had no idea that in those sparse interactions she had with him, Brian had developed an obsession with her. And so on the night that Brooke would be murdered, Brian went out and just kept thinking about her. And when he showed up at her house later that night, he was determined to have sex with her, whether she wanted to or not. And when Brooke denied him, Brian raped and then murdered her. Brian's name had come up in Brooke's murder investigation, but only in passing. And after 2 years went by, it looked like he would get away with his horrific crime. But then Brian had become obsessed with Erica Norman, another Vincennes University sophomore who had light brown hair and light eyes. Brian knew Erica from work, and just like he had done with Brooke, he decided he was going to have sex with her no matter what. And on that night in July of 1999, he went to Erica's place to watch movies, but then just assaulted and murdered her almost identically to how he had done it 2 years earlier at Brooke's house. In fact, putting the towels in the bath and soaking the knife in the sink was something Brian had seen in a movie and imitated. But this time with Erica, he moved her body to a field across the border in Illinois, thinking that would help distance himself from the crime. But one of Erica's friends knew that Brian had gone to Erica's house on the night she disappeared. And so when Detectives Winkler and Dunham tracked Brian down, they convinced him to provide a DNA sample, and when the results came back, investigators finally got their match to Brooke's killer's DNA. Brian was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years without chance for parole. To honor Brooke's love of writing and her belief that journalists could change the world, the Indiana Collegiate Press Association established the Brooke Baker Indiana Collegiate Journalist of the Year Award, and it continues to inspire young journalists to use their work to help others. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you like today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast. We also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and also Runful. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories, just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Today's podcast features 3 unique stories about obsessions. The audio from all 3 stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The First Floor, and it's about a woman who starts hearing strange noises coming from her downstairs. The second story you'll hear is called The Shaman, and to this day, it's one of the creepiest stories I've ever heard. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Raven-Haired Woman, and it's about one man's dream that slowly became his reality. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please secretly use the Amazon Music follow button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth, and then just put their brush back. Okay, let's get into our first story called The First Floor. In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and got her own place across town. For the first few months she was living there, she never noticed anything strange. But about 3 months into living there, things started to get a little bit weird. It started with a whole bunch of hang-up calls where someone from different numbers would call, she'd answer, and she could hear them breathing, but they weren't saying anything. And then she started getting these huge bouquets of flowers delivered to her front step, but they were delivered from anonymous. Then, after that, she started noticing things in her kitchen and her living room were going missing. Things like plates, cups, drink coasters, salt shakers, forks and knives. Little things, but since she lived alone and she was the only one moving these things, they really stood out. Melissa had this habit that every time she went to bed, she would unplug her TV. She had this irrational fear if she didn't do that, that it would spark a fire and her house would burn down in the middle of the night. So she was pretty obsessive compulsive about always making sure the TV was unplugged before she went upstairs to bed. And so one night, around the same time she's getting these hang-up calls and there's flowers being sent to her door and things are going missing, she unplugs her TV and she goes up to bed. The next morning she gets up and comes downstairs and the TV's plugged in again. She convinces herself that, well, she must have forgot to unplug the TV. As rare of an event as that is, it has to be what happened. And so that night, she unplugs the TV and remembers looking directly at the plug, confirming that, yes, I've unplugged the TV. And then she puts it down and looks again at the outlet. It's not plugged in. It's definitely not plugged in. And then she goes upstairs to bed. The next morning when she walks downstairs, she had the sense of dread that when she turned the corner, because her TV was right at the bottom of the stairs, that when she turned the corner, it would be plugged in again and her worst nightmare would come true, that something is happening on my first floor when I'm asleep at night. And as she comes down the stairs and turns the corner, what does she see? The TV is plugged in again. She's horrified but has no idea what to do. It's not some malicious act. And she's telling herself, well, maybe I forgot again. But then she's like, no, I remember last night staring at the plug. I definitely unplugged it. And so she flies around her first floor to make sure, one, everything is locked, but two, no one else is in here. And when she's satisfied that, yup, it's empty down here, and two, everything is locked, she sits there thinking, well, now what do I do? Do I call the police and say, someone's plugging in my TV? You know, she can't do anything. And it was at this point that Melissa developed a very real fear of her first floor. And she began going to bed so early at night because she could not be on that floor when it started to get dark. And so imagine living alone, being afraid of going down to your first floor, how scary it would be at night when you're laying in bed, your door's shut, and any noise you hear in the house, you're going to attribute to your first floor. And so Melissa was living this absolutely wretched life where she's scared of everything outside of her bedroom. And so with that as context, Melissa goes to bed one night super early, probably like 3 o'clock. The sun's not even down yet, but she's upstairs. But eventually it does get dark outside and she still has not fallen asleep. And so she sits up in bed and she turns on the TV. And right away, the channels on the screen start to change. And she's thinking, oh, I must be laying on the remote. But then she remembers the remote's in my hand. And so she's looking at the remote and then she's looking at the TV. She's not touching her remote. And the channels are still cycling. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which means her downstairs TV was connected to her upstairs TV and vice versa. If one was changing the channel, in real time, the other changed the channel. And so as she's looking at her remote and not touching it, and looking at the screen as the channels are changing, it dawns on her that someone downstairs is changing the channels. And so, frozen in fear, all she can think to do is turn off her TV, because that's the one function that does not have any impact on the other TV. So she turns the TV off. And so, in total darkness, in a house she's already terrified of, she is straining her ears to try to hear some sign that this is either someone's down there flipping through channels, or this is nothing, and I just happened to turn the TV on when the skybox was malfunctioning. And as she's sitting there, all she can hear is her own breathing, and she can feel the pounding of her heart in her chest. But she doesn't hear any sounds in her house. She doesn't hear the TV on. She doesn't hear footsteps, doors opening, none of that. It's silence in the house. So after what probably felt like an eternity, she just grabbed the pillow and clutched it in front of her and put her head into the pillow and just laid like that until she eventually fell asleep. The next morning when she gets up, the sun is out, and it's this huge relief, because suddenly, with the sunlight pouring in the windows, it was like the house wasn't scary anymore. And she's telling herself, you know what, that had to have been just some anomaly with the skybox. I bet I go downstairs and the TV's unplugged. And so she goes downstairs and the TV is unplugged. And so that for her kind of confirms that, okay, the paranoia is getting to me. I'm losing my mind a little bit. I gotta tell someone what's going on. And so as it happens, that day she was going to a family birthday party. And so when she gets there, she pulls her older brother aside and says, here's the strange things that are happening in my house with the skybox and all this. And at first, he looked at her like, really? This is what's going on? You're seeing ghosts in your house? But when she really focused on the specific things that were happening, like the plug going back into the wall 2 separate times, and then the skybox thing. So the TV is kind of wrapped up in the weirdness that's been happening in her house and the missing items in her house. And so for the brother, it all kind of added up to, okay, this does seem a little bit weird. And he offered to live with her for a few days and just see it for himself. And as they're talking, their younger brother happens to walk by, overhears the conversation, and says, oh, I'll stay there too. For 4 days, the two brothers lived on the first floor of Melissa's house, and they don't see anything, they don't hear anything, it's completely ordinary. And Melissa at first was reassured, but then started to think, does that mean whoever's been doing this stuff is watching my house really closely and knows that I have, protection at my house right now and they're staying away? Does that mean I'm being watched really closely? And so finally, when her brothers are getting ready to leave after the 4th day, she was practically begging them to stay. She couldn't stand the idea of staying in this house. Her brothers reassured her that she had nothing to worry about, but if she experienced anything weird, anytime, any day, just call or text and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although she did not feel reassured, it was starting to get late, at least by her standards. It was like 3 o'clock, so the sun's getting close to going down, so she needs to go upstairs. So she goes back in her house and does like 20 trips around her house to confirm everything is shut, everything is locked, no one's in the house, everything is safe, and then she goes upstairs to bed. But like most nights, she was so scared of everything outside of her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. And as she's laying there in utter silence in her room, she hears the unmistakable sound of her back door opening. And she hears footsteps walking through her first floor, and then she hears the TV turn on, and her brothers have been watching her TV last, and they had the volume set really, really high. So as soon as the TV went on, it blared all through the house. And immediately the TV turned back off, because whoever turned it on knew that that was going to wake up whoever was in the house. Melissa doesn't know what to do. Before, whatever the heck was happening in her house was a little bit subtle. It was like she had to think about what she was hearing to confirm it was actually happening. Now, this person is just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and flipping on the TV and blaring it through the house. And so she immediately is like, oh my God, what do I do? And she picks up her phone and she calls her brother. And he picks up right away and she goes, someone is in the house right now. The brother's like, I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me. So Melissa's shaking out of fear, and she gets up as slowly as she can, and she walks over to the window to get as far away from the door, which was locked, as she possibly could. And she's glancing out the window, waiting to see her brother pull up as she listens for any sign that this person downstairs has begun walking upstairs. Finally, Melissa sees out of the corner of her eye her brother's car pulls up across the street, and he, along with her younger brother, hop out. They run across the street towards her house. They hop over the fence, and they run down the alley between her house and her neighbors, and they go towards the back out of sight. She's still on the phone with him, and she's saying, do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? And he says, hold on. He goes to the back of the house where he knows you can look in and basically see the whole first floor. And as soon as he gets to that spot where she's expecting him to give her a report, and he pauses, there's silence on the phone, and she goes, what do you see? And he says, okay, yep, there is someone in your living room right now. I'm gonna hang up and call the police, and I'm gonna call you right back. Now, Melissa knew what she heard was very real to her. But to have it confirmed by her brother right now took this to a whole nother level of fear. Now she's legitimately fearing for her life. There is a person, an intruder in my house right now. Confirmed. They are right downstairs and they've been coming into my house probably for weeks. And so her brother hangs up the phone and begins calling the police. Meanwhile, Melissa is just standing in this room, horrified as she listens to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. But because she was hearing the footsteps clearly downstairs, she decided she would just walk over to her door and look through the keyhole, which was oversized on her door. And if you looked through it and over to the left, you'd actually look downstairs to the first floor. You'd only see a sliver of the first floor. And so very carefully, she walks her way over to the door. And as she kneels down to look through the keyhole, her phone rings. It was in her pocket and it wasn't on silent. It was on loud and it was her brother calling back. And she kind of fumbles for her phone. She drops it on the ground. It's still ringing. And she finally silences it. And then reflexively, she pokes her head back and looks through the keyhole. And standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her, is a man with a hat pulled over his eyes who's clearly heard the sound. And he begins walking up the stairs. She's falling over backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs to get her brothers inside. She hears them come charging inside. She hears this epic struggle on the stairs, and she hears this person who's in her house, because it was a voice she didn't recognize, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it's quiet. And so she opens that door because she wants to help if she can. And she looks and she sees her brothers have this man pinned on the stairs. He's not moving. And she sees her younger brother is holding something. And he holds it up to her and he just shakes his head, and it's a frickin' knife. And then she puts it together that the stranger in her house was carrying this knife. And before she can even take that information in, the older brother takes the hat off of this guy, and it's their mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same one they all believed had an inappropriate attraction to Melissa. Police show up and take him away, and he quickly admitted to sneaking into her house for months. They don't know how he got in, and he would never tell them, but he admitted that, yep, I was breaking in almost every single night. But he never gave a good reason why. He just started doing it. Police cited mental illness as the likely culprit for why he was doing it, and the family believed this could be something more sinister, but either way, he was given 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. Our next story is called The Shaman. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she had been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver. And so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her and he had no idea what happened to her, but after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, "Okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make." And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women, and if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them. And he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground. And he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep. And then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized. And then at this point, Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewey, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewey that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewey was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went to the cemetery, out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Raven-Haired Woman. In 1889, when Karl Tanzler was just 12 years old and living with his family in Dresden, Germany, he had a very strange dream. In this dream, he found himself in this black void where everywhere he looked, it was just nothingness. And then behind him, he heard footsteps. And so he whips himself around and he looks, and there's this woman dressed in this big, puffy, elegant white dress walking towards him out of the darkness. And when she walks right up in front of him, she comes to a stop, and she introduces herself as Anna Constantia von Brockdorf, who was a real person in the early 1700s. She was a noblewoman in Germany, and she would tell Carl that she is actually a distant relative of his, and that she was here to pass on a very important message. Carl was rooted to the spot. He didn't know if he should be afraid of what she was going to say, or excited or nervous, but before he could decide, Anna had already turned and was pointing in the direction she had appeared out of. And so Carl turns and looks in the direction she was pointing, and out of this blackness, out of this void, came this woman's face. It was a face detached from a body. It almost looked like a floating picture of a woman's face. And as this face floated closer and closer to them, Carl was immediately struck by just how beautiful this woman was. Her hair was jet black like a raven's feathers, and her skin was white like porcelain. But there was something off about this woman, this floating face. She looked sad and kind of frail. And so as Carl found himself staring at this face, which was now right next to them, Anna spoke to him again, and she would tell Carl that this woman, the floating face, she's going to appear in your life later on, and it is your mission given by God to save her. She's going to be very ill, very sick, and you need to find a way to keep her alive. Then Carl, in real life, woke up. And immediately he was struck by just how visceral that dream had been. It really felt like that had just happened to him. But after a few moments, it seemed like, okay, that was just a dream. But unlike other visceral dreams he had had in the past, this one did not gradually fade from his memory. Instead, over the course of that day, the memory specifically of the raven-haired woman's face really seemed to become more clear and more concrete in his mind, to the point where at the end of that day, he could easily remember exactly what she looked like. Over the following days and months and years, Carl periodically would have this same dream, this same vision of his distant relative Anna, who would come out of the void, and she would remind him to be on the lookout for this raven-haired woman when God sent her to him. But despite these constant reminders in his dreams, and Carl being ever vigilant to look for this raven-haired woman in real life, he never actually found her. He never met this woman he was supposed to save. Fast forward to 1926, Carl was 39 years old. By this point, he had gotten married, not to the raven-haired woman, but instead to a local woman in Dresden. And the pair had had 2 daughters together, and they lived a simple life. And, by and large, Carl seemed rather content and happy with his life. However, secretly, he was a little disappointed that these dreams, these visions that he was having of Anna and the raven-haired woman, that they had not come true, that it really had just been a dream. That year, due to an economic downturn in Germany, Carl and his family left Germany and emigrated to the United States, where they believed there would be better opportunities for them. And when they arrived in the United States, they settled in Central Florida, but within a year, Carl and his wife had a severe falling out and they split up. And so Carl would leave the family home in Central Florida, and he would resettle several hundred miles south in Southern Florida in a town called Key West. And it would be in Key West that Carl would get a job as an X-ray technician at a local hospital, and it would also be in Key West that Carl's life would change forever. Less than a year after settling in Key West, Carl was at the hospital going about his day when an older woman walked into the office, and she said to Carl that she was there to get her daughter, her 21-year-old daughter, an X-ray of her chest because her daughter apparently couldn't stop coughing and they were concerned about it. And so Carl began doing the paperwork with the mother when suddenly the daughter came into the office. And as soon as Carl saw her, he knew immediately that she was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. She walked in and she sat down in a chair, and Carl just stopped what he was doing and stared at the daughter. And then he kind of broke out of it and turned his attention back to the mother, and he said to her, "Ma'am, don't worry. I will do everything in my power to save your daughter's life." Now, the mother didn't know what was wrong with her daughter, and so this was both really helpful that this man she was talking to was so willing to help, and also kind of ominous that he was already insinuating that she could be dying. But either way, the mother said, "Thank you very much. We really appreciate that." And so Carl and the mother, they finished their paperwork, and then Carl quickly left from behind his desk and hustled over to the daughter, and he introduced himself and he reiterated that she was in good hands. And the daughter was a little bit weirded out by this, but she was polite and said thank you, and she said her name was Elena. And so Carl would take Elena and bring her back and give her the x-ray, and unfortunately he would discover through this x-ray that she had tuberculosis. Today, that disease is easily curable, but at the time, that was a death sentence. When Carl saw this, though, in a weird way, it almost made him happy because this was another indication that, this really was the raven-haired woman from his dreams. Not only did she look the part, but she also had arrived in desperate need of help. And so now Carl needed to find a way to save her. Even though he was just an x-ray technician, he was not a doctor, and so he had no clue how to begin to treat tuberculosis. But that didn't stop Carl. Over the next year, Carl would be in touch with Elena and her family on a near daily basis, updating them on all of the new techniques to fight tuberculosis that he was doing all this research on, and he would tell them about experimental procedures and drugs they could try, even sometimes paying out of pocket for them to go try them. He would also bring Elena into the office as often as he possibly could to x-ray her again and again and again to see if perhaps she was making good progress. But unfortunately, over the course of that year where he was doing everything he could, it just didn't work. The disease ravaged Elena's body, and on October 31st, 1931, so roughly a year after Carl had first met Elena, Elena would unfortunately pass away. Elena's family was devastated by this, but their grief didn't even compare to Carl's grief. It was like Carl had lost his life too. He couldn't believe he had failed his mission and let the raven-haired woman die. When it came time to bury Elena, Carl said, "Let me pay for the most elaborate gravesite we can possibly make. Let me set up a mausoleum for her." A mausoleum is an external building that sits in a cemetery that effectively serves as a kind of shrine to the deceased. And so her family, they understood that Carl had become very, very close with Elena, although they didn't fully understand the relationship, but they did understand she meant a lot to him, and so they agreed to let him do this. After Elena was buried inside of this small temple that Carl had built for her, Carl began spending virtually all of his time kneeling inside of it, crying and begging for Elena's forgiveness. Elena's family was well aware that Carl was doing this, and at first they kind of just let it happen, but after several months they began to tell Carl, you really need to let her go, you need to begin to move on. But Carl refused. In fact, over time, he only became more and more obsessed with Elena. Finally, after 7 years of Carl doing this, Elena's family decided, enough is enough. He really needs to stop making her loss all about him. It's not his loss, it's our loss. We're her family. And so the family decided the only way to kind of get Carl to stop doing what he was doing is to demand he give the key back that gave him access into the small area inside of the mausoleum. So one night, Elena's sister, whose name was Florinda, decided to go over to Carl's house unannounced and confront him and get the key back from him. And so she hopped in her car and she drove over to his property. His house was kind of set back off the road behind some trees, and so you had to drive down this kind of winding driveway to get to it. And so Florinda turned onto his driveway and she began driving. And when his house came into view, the first thing she noticed was a number of the windows on the first floor were all lit up. Clearly, Carl was home, and as she's driving towards the house, she's just looking in these windows, and for a second, she sees Carl, and he's very elegantly dressed in a suit or a tuxedo, and he's ballroom dancing with this woman who's also very elegantly dressed as well. And for a second, Florinda considered turning around and not disturbing him, but then she thought, you know what, this has been going on for so long, I just need to get this over with. And so she drove her car and stopped in front of Carl's house. She hopped out, she walked up onto his porch, and she knocked on his front door. Inside, she could hear music was clearly playing, but just a few seconds after she had knocked, the music was cut off, and then no one came to the door. And so Florinda knows there's people inside this house, and so she knocks again, but again, there's no movement in the house. It's just silent, as if the people inside are pretending not to be there. And so finally, frustrated, Florinda knocks on the door a third time and says, "Carl, I know you're in there. I have to talk to you about my sister. Please come out here." And so finally she heard the shuffling of feet, and then she heard the sound of the door unlocking, and it opened up just a crack. And through this crack, Carl looked through, and he looked out at Florinda very suspiciously, and he said to her, "What do you want?" And Florinda would say, "Look, I'm here to talk to you about my sister. Can I please come inside for a second, or can you come out here and talk to me?" But Carl pretty much immediately said no, and then he shut the door. However, before he shut the door, Carl had very briefly stepped out of the way, allowing Florinda to see through that gap into the house. So before the door actually shut, she got to see who and what was inside that house. And what she saw was the woman Carl had been dancing with, and the woman was seated in a chair maybe halfway through the house, and she was facing the door, and Florinda knew immediately it was her sister. And so she's standing on the porch having no idea what to make of what she's just discovered. And so feeling kind of overwhelmed, she just kind of staggered off the front porch, she turned around, she ran into her car, and she drove off to tell the police. When the police came back, they knocked on the front door, and they demanded that Carl let them see the woman he was there with. And so at this point, Carl knew the gig was up, and so he opened the door and he allowed them to come inside. And when the police went inside, they saw the woman he was with, and sure enough, it was Elena. However, Elena was deceased and had been for 7 years. After her death, Carl said he was able to talk to her inside of her mausoleum, and so that was why he was going back there every single night, because he and Elena were spending time together. And then at some point in 1933, so 2 years after Elena has been dead and buried, Carl would say she told him while he was visiting her mausoleum that she didn't like being in the mausoleum and that she wanted to come back with him and stay at his house. And so the following day, Carl had shown up with a child's wagon, and he pulled her out of her coffin, pulled her out of the mausoleum, put her corpse in this wagon, and wheeled her back to his house. He had continued to go to the mausoleum every night for the next 5 years just to keep up appearances, but Elena's body never went back inside of it. She would stay at his house, where he painstakingly attempted to restore Elena's very badly decomposed body to its original form. He strung piano wire through her entire body, connecting all of her bones together to keep her skeleton intact. He replaced her eyes with glass eyes, and he began rubbing the special wax all over her skin. He also stuffed her insides full of rags in order to give her a full, natural look, and he constantly sprayed her with perfume to reduce the smell. Once she was, in his eyes, back to normal, he began spending as much time with her as he possibly could. He would change her outfits constantly, he would put on makeup, and he would give her new jewelry, and he would talk to her about the ups and downs of life, he would laugh with her, he would cry with her, he would sleep with her. Carl would admit that ultimately his goal with keeping Elena in his home was to eventually still save her life. He believed if he could somehow get her body up into the stratosphere, that the radiation up there would bring her back to life. And if he could do that, he would be fulfilling his God-given mission to protect her. But Carl never got a chance to launch her into the stratosphere. Instead, he was charged with wantonly and maliciously destroying a grave and removing a body without authorization. However, these charges would be dropped and Carl would be set free. As for Elena, her body was returned to her family and they would bury her in Key West. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the Amazon Music follow button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put their brush back. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see you.